In November 1983, the small town of Hawkins, Indiana, was a place of quiet routine, where children rode bicycles through tree-lined streets and families gathered for dinner beneath warm kitchen lights. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the only monsters anyone worried about existed in Dungeons and Dragons campaigns played in basement rec rooms. This orderly peace would shatter on a single autumn evening when a 12-year-old boy vanished into something beyond comprehension. Will Byers disappeared on the 6th of November, cycling home after an extended gaming session with his closest friends. The boy had spent the evening in Mike Wheeler's basement, rolling dice and battling imaginary creatures alongside Lucas Sinclair and Dustin Henderson. Their campaign remained unfinished when Will departed, pedaling through darkness toward the home he would never reach. Something followed him through those woods, something that should not exist in the world of science fairs and breakfast cereals. The creature that pursued Will belonged to a dimension existing parallel to Hawkins, a shadow realm the children would later name the Upside Down. This alternate space mirrored the town's geography precisely while transforming every familiar element into decay and menace. Where Hawkins proper featured houses and schools, the Upside Down offered ruins choked with dark vines and floating spores. The air hung thick with corruption. Nothing lived there except things that fed on living worlds. The Demogorgon, as the boys named it after their game's monster, represented the most immediate threat from this shadow dimension. The creature moved between worlds through temporary rifts, hunting with predatory intelligence, its faceless head open to reveal rings of teeth designed for tearing flesh. The creature took Will alive rather than killing him immediately, dragging the boy through a temporary gate into the Upside Down. This choice, never fully explained, suggested purpose beyond simple hunger. Joyce Byers, Will's mother, refused to accept her son's disappearance as ordinary tragedy. While search parties combed the woods and authorities suggested the boy had drowned in a nearby quarry, Joyce experienced phenomena that defied rational explanation. Lights in her home flickered with pattern and purpose. Her telephone melted from impossible heat during a call where she heard her son's voice. These incidents might have been dismissed as grief-induced hallucination, except they produced physical evidence and witnesses. Jim Hopper, Hawkins police chief, approached the investigation with professional skepticism that gradually eroded into disturbed belief. His inquiries led to Hawkins National Laboratory, a government facility conducting classified research on the town's outskirts. The laboratory's involvement in Will's disappearance seemed impossible until evidence accumulated beyond dismissal. Scientists there had torn open a gateway to the alternate dimension, creating the rift through which the Demogorgon travelled. The same night Will vanished, a young girl escaped from Hawkins' laboratory wearing only a hospital gown and terror. The boys discovered her hiding in the woods during their own search for Will. She possessed no name, only a number tattooed on her wrist, 11. The girl demonstrated extraordinary abilities, moving objects through thought alone and accessing dimensions beyond normal perception. Her powers stemmed from experiments conducted by Dr. Martin Brenner, the laboratory's director, who had raised her as subject rather than daughter, despite calling himself Papa. 11's integration into the group occurred rapidly, through necessity and genuine affection. Mike's family sheltered her in their basement, hiding her from government agents. The girl possessed limited vocabulary and no understanding of normal childhood, having spent her entire existence confined to laboratory rooms. Her favourite food, Eggo waffles, became both sustenance and symbol of the simple pleasures she'd been denied. The boys taught her about friendship, while she taught them that impossible things existed just beyond what authorities acknowledged. The connection between 11 and the Upside Down ran deeper than anyone initially understood. Her powers allowed psychic exploration of vast distances, projected consciousness travelling while her body remained motionless. Dr. Brenner had exploited this ability for espionage, forcing Eleven to spy on Soviet officials. During one such session, she encountered something that should have remained undiscovered. The Demogorgon existed in the space she travelled through, and her contact with it created a catastrophic tear between dimensions. The gateway beneath Hawkins' laboratory originated not from scientific advancement, but from a frightened child touching something monstrous. Nancy Wheeler, Mike's older sister, faced her own confrontation with the Upside Down's horror. Her friend Barbara Holland vanished during a party, pulled into the alternate dimension through a temporary gate in Steve Harrington's backyard swimming pool. Nancy's search for Barb led to partnership with Will's older brother Jonathan, whose camera had captured something impossible at the scene of another incident. Together they discovered the Upside Down's existence independently of their younger siblings, finding themselves in the Shadow Realm through a temporary portal in the woods. Joyce's determination to reach her son produced the campaign's most memorable innovation. Unable to communicate with Will through normal means, she strung Christmas lights throughout her home, painting an alphabet on the wall. The lights allowed Will to spell messages from the Upside Down, confirming his survival and providing crucial information. This makeshift communication system demonstrated that love could bridge dimensions when technology failed. The image of Joyce speaking to painted letters, while lights flickered in response, became testament to maternal devotion's power. The conspiracy surrounding Hawkins' laboratory extended beyond dimensional research into systematic cover-up. When Barb's parents searched for their daughter, agents destroyed evidence and manipulated witnesses. When Hopper got too close to truth, they threatened him with violence. Dr. Brenner's obsession with recovering Eleven drove increasingly desperate measures, including sending agents to kill anyone who sheltered her. The government that claimed to protect its citizens instead treated them as acceptable casualties in pursuit of scientific advancement and Cold War advantage. The sensory deprivation tank represented Brenner's most sophisticated tool for directing Eleven's abilities. Floating in salted water, stripped of external stimuli, Eleven could project her consciousness further than normal circumstances allowed. The laboratory contained an industrial version of this equipment, but the children constructed a makeshift alternative using a kiddie pool, bags of salt, and a middle school gymnasium. This improvised tank allowed Eleven to locate Will in the Upside Down, confirming his survival and providing hope for rescue. The plan to save Will required confronting the Demogorgon directly, while navigating both government opposition and dimensional barriers. Hopper and Joyce entered the Upside Down through the laboratory's gate, searching the shadow version of Hawkins, while the creature hunted elsewhere. They found Will in the parallel version of his home, barely alive after a week of breathing toxic air and evading monsters. The boys' survival demonstrated remarkable resilience, though the experience left marks that wouldn't be understood for months. Meanwhile, the children faced the Demogorgon in their own confrontation. The creature attacked them in the middle school, drawn by Eleven's presence. Her powers had weakened from overuse, and Dr. Brenner's agents had cornered the group. The Demogorgon's arrival transformed the situation, killing agents indiscriminately and focusing ultimate attention on Eleven herself. She had opened the gate that allowed its passage into the world. It wanted her specifically. Eleven's battle with the Demogorgon required everything remaining of her strength. She lifted the creature telekinetically, holding it suspended while it shrieked and thrashed. The effort visibly drained her, blood streaming from her nose and ears. The boys watched helplessly as their friend faced the monster alone, her small figure silhouetted against the creature's mass. With final effort, she disintegrated the Demogorgon into drifting particles, dissolving the threat. Then she too dissolved, vanishing from sight. The immediate aftermath brought both relief and grief. Will returned to his family, hospitalized but alive. The laboratory claimed a gas leak explained the various incidents, a cover story accepted by residents desperate for normalcy. Barb's fate remained. Officially unknown, her parents left to wonder, while Nancy carried guilt for surviving when her friend did not. The boys mourned 11, believing she had sacrificed herself to save them. Mike particularly struggled with the loss, having formed a connection that transcended the brief time they'd known each other. As 1983 gave way to 1984, Hawkins residents attempted to return to normal life. Will was home, alive if changed. 11 was gone, presumably lost in her battle against the creature. The gate beneath the laboratory stood closed, its guardian fallen. Yet the slug Will coughed into his sink suggested the Upside Down's influence persisted, waiting patiently beneath the surface of ordinary life. Hopper, driving to a secluded clearing in the woods, left a box of Ego waffles in a concealed container, suggesting he knew something others did not. The box disappeared by his next visit. 1 year would pass before the town understood how deeply the infection had taken root. By October 1984, Will Byers had returned to school, though his classmates now called him Zombie Boy. The nickname held more truth than anyone realized. His time in the Upside Down had created a connection that refused to sever, a bridge between dimensions that something vast and hungry was beginning to cross. The visions began as flashes, brief moments where Will perceived two realities simultaneously. Walking through Hawkins, he would suddenly find himself standing in the shadow version, surrounded by decay and darkness. These episodes lasted seconds initially, disorienting but manageable. Dr. Owens, the new director at Hawkins Laboratory, monitored Will carefully, running tests to understand the lingering effects of dimensional exposure. The boy assured everyone he felt fine. The episodes would pass. He wanted only to return to normal life with his friends. The entity watching through these visions possessed intelligence and patience, far exceeding the Demogorgon's predatory simplicity. The Mind Flayer, as the boys would name it after their game's godlike villain, existed as vast shadow creature in the Upside Down, all tentacles and storms. It had observed the children's interference with its plans during the previous year. Now it studied Will specifically, using the boy's lingering connection to learn about the human world it intended to invade. Each vision provided information. Each flash allowed deeper infiltration. Dustin's discovery seemed unrelated initially. The boy found a strange creature in his trash can on Halloween night, a small slug-like being that he assumed was an undiscovered species. He named it D'Artagnan, Dart for short, and kept it hidden in his room like a secret pet. The creature grew rapidly, shedding skin and developing disturbing features. When it ate his mother's cat, Dustin realized his pet was no natural animal, but rather a juvenile demogorgon, what the group would call a demodog. The Upside Down was breeding. New faces arrived in Hawkins that autumn, bringing both friendship and danger. Max Mayfield transferred to the middle school, a California transplant whose skateboarding skills and arcade prowess immediately caught the boys' attention. Her stepbrother Billy Hargrove enrolled at the high school, his aggressive personality and troubled home life creating ripples of unease. Max sought acceptance and found it gradually within the group, though Lucas and Dustin's competing affections created temporary tensions. Billy's presence foreshadowed darker developments, his anger masking vulnerability that something malevolent would eventually exploit. The secret that changed everything remained hidden in the woods outside town. 11 had survived her confrontation with the Demogorgon, though barely. She'd emerged in the woods, weak and terrified, and wandered for days before Hopper found her. He brought her to his grandfather's cabin, a secluded structure where she could hide from the government agents still searching. For nearly a year, 11 lived there in isolation, seeing only Hopper, learning to read through books he provided, watching television to understand the world outside. The cabin became both sanctuary and prison, protecting her while denying her the normal life she desperately wanted. The relationship between Hopper and Eleven evolved from necessity into genuine family bond. He became the father figure she'd never had, teaching her beyond academic subjects into life itself. They argued as real fathers and daughters do, particularly about his strict rules keeping her confined. She wanted to see Mike, to reconnect with the friends who'd accepted her. Hopper insisted it remained too dangerous. That discovery meant returning to the laboratory. Their conflicts reflected authentic parent-child dynamics, the push and pull between protection and freedom that defines adolescence. Hopper's rules eventually proved too restrictive for a girl with psychic powers and adolescent emotions. Eleven ventured out, using her abilities to spy on Mike from afar. She witnessed him with Max and misinterpreted their friendship as betrayal. Her limited social experience unable to pass normal interactions. Anger and isolation drove her to act on information she'd discovered about her past. A television news report about Terry Ives, the woman who claimed Hawkins' laboratory had stolen her daughter. The journey to Chicago represented Eleven's most independent action yet, a deliberate choice to seek answers rather than wait for others to provide them. She found her biological mother catatonic in her sister's home, Terry's mind destroyed by electroshock treatments Brenner had administered to make her forget. Through psychic connection, Eleven accessed Terry's memories, experiencing her mother's trauma and discovering she had a sister. Another experiment from the laboratory numbered 8. Carly Prasad, designated 8 during her time at Hawkins' lab, had escaped years before 11 and built a life on anger rather than hope. She gathered other outcasts around her, using her illusion powers to pursue vengeance against those who'd hurt them. Kaylee's abilities created convincing hallucinations, making people see threats that didn't exist or hiding things that did. She welcomed 11 with genuine affection mixed with recruitment, offering belonging in exchange for joining her vendetta. For a brief period, 11 embraced this darker path. Carly styled her appearance with punk aesthetics, teaching her to channel rage into power. They tracked down former laboratory personnel. 11 prepared to kill a man whose only crime was working security at a facility whose true purpose he hadn't understood. In that moment, face to face with a terrified man begging for mercy while his daughters slept in nearby rooms, 11 recognized she was becoming something she didn't want to be. Carly offered family through shared trauma and revenge, but 11 already had family and they needed her. The vision that pulled her back to Hawkins came through psychic perception, sensing her friends in terrible danger. She left Chicago despite Kaylee's protests, choosing connection over vengeance, love over hate. This decision defined her character more than any power demonstration, establishing that strength meant protecting rather than punishing, building rather than destroying. She returned to find Hawkins under siege from threats both dimensional and governmental. Will's episodes had escalated into full possession. During one particularly intense vision, the Mind Flayer had reached through their connection and entered the boy's body, establishing itself inside his consciousness. Will remained present, but no longer in control, a passenger watching the entity use his eyes to observe and his voice to lie. The Mind Flayer spoke through him occasionally, acknowledging its presence with cold logic. It now understood the human world intimately, knew the people fighting against it, recognized their weaknesses. The discovery of tunnel systems beneath Hawkins revealed the Mind Flayer's invasion had progressed far beyond isolated incidents. The tunnel spread like corrupted veins under fields, roads, and buildings, all connecting back to the laboratory's gate. The Upside Down was literally growing beneath the town, transforming local geography into extension of itself. Hopper and Bob Newby, Joyce's boyfriend, explored these passages and barely escaped with their lives when demodogs swarmed through the darkness. Bob represented normal humanity at its most admirable, a Radio Shack manager whose intelligence and kindness had won Joyce's affection. He solved puzzles that helped map the tunnels, cracked coded messages, and volunteered for dangerous tasks despite having no combat training or supernatural abilities. His love for Joyce extended to her sons, treating Will with patience and Jonathan with respect. He proposed they leave Hawkins together, move somewhere safe where Joyce could finally rest. She almost agreed. The plan to save Will required separating him from the Mind Flayer's influence through a form of psychic exorcism. Joyce, Jonathan, and Nancy isolated Will in Hopper's cabin, heating the space to uncomfortable temperatures. The Mind Flayer preferred cold, thrived in it. Heat weakened its hold, allowing Will to surface occasionally and communicate. Through these brief moments of clarity, he revealed crucial information, including how the various parts of the Upside Down's invasion connected as single organism. Burning the tunnels would hurt the Mind Flayer, potentially forcing it to retreat. The mission to torch the tunnel hub required precise timing and desperate courage. While Joyce worked to free Will's mind, Hopper and a small team descended into the earth with flamethrowers and determination. They ignited the infection's heart, watching tendrils writhe and shriek as fire consumed them. The Mind Flayer felt this assault through every connected piece of itself, pain transmitted across the hive intelligence. It responded by sending all available demodogs to converge on the laboratory, attempting to reach the children gathered there. Bob's death came during the evacuation from Hawkins' laboratory as demodogs breached security and hunted through corridors. He volunteered to reach the building's control room, manually resetting breakers to restore power and unlock doors trapping others. He succeeded, his actions saving Joyce, Will, Hopper, and several others. Racing back to them, visible through glass doors, he paused to smile at Joyce with relief and love. Then demodogs pulled him down, and the man who solved puzzles with patience and cared for troubled children disappeared under claws and teeth. His heroism required neither powers nor weapons, only willingness to act when others needed help. The laboratory descended into chaos as creatures from another dimension overwhelmed security forces. Owens, injured but alive, provided access codes and assistance despite his organization's betrayals. The facility that had created these problems now burned as those problems devoured everyone within reach. Demodogs filled hallways, driven by the Mind Flayer's desperate fury as its physical form in the Upside Down suffered assault from the tunnel fires. Eleven's return transformed certain defeat into possibility. She appeared when hope seemed lost, using her powers to hold back demodog attacks and clear paths to safety. The girl who'd spent months hidden away emerged as their most powerful defender, her abilities having grown during isolation. She could now destroy multiple creatures simultaneously, crush objects at distance, and maintain concentration under combat conditions. The friends reunited mid-crisis, Mike's joy at seeing her alive competing with immediate terror of their circumstances. The permanent solution required closing the gate itself, sealing the rift that allowed the Upside Down's influence to spread. Only 11 possessed sufficient power for this task. She descended into the laboratory's sublevels with Hopper as protection, finding the massive tear hanging in air like wound in reality. Through the opening, tentacles writhed, and the Mind Flayer's shadow form pressed against dimensional barriers, attempting to force itself through before closure became possible. Closing the gate demanded concentration beyond anything 11 had previously attempted. She stood before the rift, blood streaming from her nose as she psychically forced the tear to seal. The Mind Flayer fought back, its presence bearing down on her consciousness, trying to break her focus. Mike's voice reached her through radio, speaking encouragement and love, reminding her of connections worth fighting for. Hopper stood ready to defend her if creatures emerged. She pulled the rift's edges together, reforming reality, cutting off the Upside Down's access. The gate closed. The immediate aftermath brought exhausted relief. The Mind Flayer's influence over Will broke when the gate sealed, the boy coughing up darkness and breathing clean air. The Demodogs collapsed simultaneously, their hive connection severed. Hawkins remained ignorant of how close it had come to dimensional invasion, accepting another cover story about laboratory accidents and chemical leaks. Those who knew the truth carried burden of secrets and trauma that would mark them permanently. The snowball arrived 1 month later, offering the children something they'd been denied during the crisis: normal adolescent experience. Mike and 11 danced beneath gymnasium lights, briefly experiencing the teenage normalcy they'd been denied. Dustin, rejected earlier by Max, found unexpected kindness from Nancy, who danced with him when no one else would. Lucas and Max reconciled their earlier tensions. Even Will smiled, surrounded by friends, finally free from possession and fear. The evening represented hope that perhaps the worst had passed, that they could finally move forward. Yet beyond the celebration, in the dark spaces between dimensions, the Mind Flayer watched Hawkins with patient malevolence. Its direct access had been cut, but it remained aware, observing from the Upside Down. The camera pulled back through the shadow dimension to reveal its massive form towering over the middle school, tentacles spreading across the sky. Its defeat was merely temporary, an obstacle rather than ending. It would find another way. It had time. Summer would bring new dangers, not from beneath the earth, but from those who sought to harness what lay beyond. The summer of 1985 brought unprecedented heat to Hawkins. Along with the grand opening of Starcourt Mall, beneath the neon lights and consumer abundance, two threats converged. Russians, desperate to access the Upside Down for Cold War advantage, had constructed a secret facility beneath the shopping centre. Their efforts would tear open what 11 had closed, releasing the Mind Flayer's influence once more into a world unprepared for its return. Starcourt represented capitalism's promise made concrete, an air-conditioned paradise offering every product and experience small-town residents could desire. The mall's arrival transformed Hawkins' economy, drawing customers from downtown shops that couldn't compete with consolidated retail. Families wandered wide corridors between fountain displays and potted plants. Teenagers claimed the arcade and food court as territory, and the structure itself became the town's new centre. Few noticed the construction vehicles that arrived at odd hours, or the armed guards protecting loading docks with unusual vigilance. The heroes of previous crises had scattered into different social circles as adolescence imposed new hierarchies. Mike and 11 had become inseparable, spending long hours together in the Wheeler basement to Hopper's increasing frustration. The chief struggled with his daughter's first romance, his protective instincts clashing with her desire for independence and normalcy. His ham-fisted attempt to separate them, threatening Mike into reducing contact, created precisely the conflict he'd hoped to avoid. 11 felt betrayed by both the boy who lied about his grandmother's illness and the father who'd manipulated the situation. Lucas had found acceptance on the basketball team, his athletic skills earning respect that bridged social divides. Max remained his girlfriend, their relationship having survived the previous year's complications. Dustin had attended science camp, forming a long-distance romance with a girl named Susie, whom his friends suspected was imaginary. Steve Harrington had graduated high school without college prospects, working at Scoops Ahoy ice cream parlour alongside Robin Buckley, a band geek whose sarcastic wit matched his own. Nancy and Jonathan worked as interns at the Hawkins Post, where sexist editors dismissed Nancy's investigative instincts while praising Jonathan's photography. Will struggled most with the changes, feeling his friends pulling away toward romantic relationships and new interests. The trauma they'd shared seemed forgotten in pursuit of normal teenage concerns. He wanted to continue their Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, maintain the closeness that had defined their childhood. Instead, he found himself increasingly alone, the party fragmenting as members pursued individual paths. His isolation would make him vulnerable to what came next. The radio transmission that Dustin intercepted seemed like puzzle rather than threat initially. His homemade Cerebro communication tower, built on a hill outside town, picked up a coded Russian broadcast. The message repeated on a loop, clearly important but encrypted. Dustin's attempts to share this discovery with his preoccupied friends met with dismissal until Steve agreed to help, partly from guilt about ignoring him and partly from genuine curiosity. Their investigation led to Scoops Ahoy, where Robin's linguistic skills identified the language and began translation work. The coded message revealed delivery schedules and security protocols for something called the Key, an operation based within Starcourt itself. The Scoops Troop, as they called themselves, began surveillance of suspicious individuals in the mall. Steve and Robin went undercover during business hours, while Dustin coordinated from a distance. When they identified armed guards protecting a loading dock, the stakes escalated beyond teenage adventure into genuine danger. They recruited Erica Sinclair, Lucas's sharp-tongued younger sister, to infiltrate air ducts too small for older participants. Beneath Starcourt, the Russian operation had achieved what Hawkins' laboratory could not. They'd successfully reopened a gate to the Upside Down, using massive machinery and electricity diverted from the town's power grid. The facility extended deep underground, rooms full of equipment and personnel working to stabilize the rift. Their government had become obsessed with dimensional research after learning of American experiments, seeing the Upside Down as potential weapon or resource to shift Cold War power dynamics. The consequences of their success would prove catastrophic. The Mind Flayer's return began subtly, its influence spreading through Hawkins before anyone recognized the pattern. The entity couldn't physically enter the world while trapped in its dimension, but it could reach through the reopened gate to possess human hosts. It selected victims strategically, taking over their minds and bodies to serve as extensions of its will. These flayed, as Nancy and Jonathan would name them, lost their individual identities while appearing outwardly normal. The Mind Flayer was building an army in secret, preparing for the moment when it could manifest physically. Billy Hargrove became the Mind Flayer's primary vessel, possessed after his car broke down near the steel mill, where the entity concentrated its presence. The lifeguard's aggressive personality made him useful, his authority at the community pool providing access to potential victims. Billy fought the possession internally, brief moments of awareness breaking through where he recognized what was happening to him. These flashes of consciousness brought terror rather than hope, understanding that his own hands committed atrocities while his will remained imprisoned and screaming. The possessed multiplied throughout June, the Mind Flayer methodically building its force. Flayed individuals gathered at the steel mill, dissolving into organic matter that the entity combined into a larger form. This flesh monster, assembled from consumed humans, could manifest in the real world independent of the gate. It hunted 11 specifically, recognizing her as the one who'd closed its access before and the greatest threat to its plans. The creature could split apart and reform, appearing as rats or humanoid shapes depending on tactical needs. 11's powers had grown unpredictable during the peaceful months. Overused during the previous crises had strained something fundamental. When she attempted to use her abilities against the flesh monster, intense pain accompanied the effort. Blood vessels burst in her eyes and nose. Her telekinesis failed at crucial moments. Something was breaking inside her, damage accumulating from years of pushing her mind beyond normal human limits. The girl who'd closed gates and defeated monsters now found herself increasingly powerless. The investigation into flayed individuals brought Nancy and Jonathan into direct conflict with their co-workers. Mrs. Driscoll, an elderly woman Nancy had interviewed about rat problems, exhibited the possession symptoms: consuming chemicals, unusual strength, and inhuman behaviour. When Nancy tried to warn her editors, they dismissed her concerns as hysterical imagination. Only Jonathan believed her, his loyalty to Nancy overriding his desire to maintain the job his family desperately needed. Their investigation, conducted without institutional support, revealed the pattern of possessions and the central role of the steel mill. Joyce had noticed anomalies beyond the mall's economic impact. Her magnets kept falling off the refrigerator, impossible unless exposed to stronger opposing force. She recruited Hopper to investigate, suspecting something scientific rather than supernatural. Their search led to industrial warehouses, government agents, and eventually to a Russian scientist named Alexei who explained the secret facility's purpose. Alexei, nicknamed Smirnov, proved friendly despite his nationality, more interested in Slurpees and Looney Tunes than ideological conflict. The convergence of investigations revealed different aspects of the same crisis. While Dustin, Steve, Robin, and Erica discovered the underground Russian base beneath Starcourt, Nancy, Jonathan, and the kids fought the flesh monster at Hopper's cabin. Joyce and Hopper, along with Murray and Alexei, travelled to the State Fair, seeking scientists who could explain how to close the Russians' gate. Each group faced dangers appropriate to their investigation. The Mind Flayer coordinating attacks through its possessed servants, while Russians protected their operation through military force. The 4th of July celebration provided both opportunity and deadline. Starcourt's festivities would draw massive crowds, and the Mind Flayer intended to consume them all, transforming Hawkins' population into flesh for its physical form. The monster had grown enormous, requiring entire buildings to contain it. Billy had gathered dozens of flayed at the steel mill, the Mind Flayer preparing for final assault. The heroes understood they had one chance to stop both the supernatural threat and the international conspiracy simultaneously. Alexei's death, shot by Russian agents at the fairground, demonstrated the stakes involved. The friendly scientist had overcome national loyalty to help prevent dimensional catastrophe, recognizing that some dangers transcended Cold War politics. His murder, casual and sudden, shocked Joyce and Hopper into accepting this was war without rules or mercy. They would need Murray, whose paranoid preparation included weapons and combat training, to survive the assault on the Russian base. The plan required splitting their forces. Dustin would guide Hopper, Joyce, and Murray through the underground facility to the gate-opening machine, while Elle and the others would face the Mind Flayer's physical manifestation. Each element needed to succeed for victory. If the gate remained open, the Mind Flayer could retreat and try again. If the monster wasn't distracted, it would consume Hawkins before anyone reached the machine. Coordination across separate battles would determine whether anyone survived the night. The mall became a battlefield as the flesh monster crashed through walls, pursuing 11. Civilians fled in panic while the creature flowed through corridors, its mass splitting and reforming to navigate obstacles. Mike, Lucas, Max, Will, Nancy, Jonathan, and Steve fought to slow it using fireworks from the mall's supply, explosives offering brief deterrent to something that felt no pain. Elle, weakened and bleeding, attempted to fight psychically, but found her powers failing at critical moments. The creature landed a direct hit, its tentacle penetrating her leg and leaving something pulsing beneath her skin. Beneath the mall, the infiltration team fought through Russian guards toward the central chamber. The facility's size dwarfed expectations, rooms extending deep into Earth with equipment worth millions. Joyce and Hopper displayed unexpected competence in combat, their years of crisis management translating to tactical effectiveness. Murray's karate training and fluent Russian provided both comic relief and practical advantage. They reached the control room, bloodied but intact, Finding the massive keys that maintain the gate's stability, the extraction of the tentacle fragment from 11's leg represented the summer's most visceral horror. Something alive remained inside her flesh, moving beneath skin and resisting removal. Jonathan sterilized a knife, while Elle screamed, the group holding her down as he cut. When the blade proved insufficient, Elle used the last reserves of her power to rip the thing out herself. Her telekinesis turned inward in a moment of excruciating desperation. The fragment, once removed, writhed independently before dying. Something in that effort broke permanently. Her powers vanished entirely. Billy's confrontation with 11 forced him to choose between the Mind Flayer's control and his own failing will. The entity commanded him to kill the girl who threatened its existence. Billy approached, violent intent clear in his possessed eyes. Then Elle spoke to him, reminding him of memories the Mind Flayer couldn't fully erase. His mother, his childhood before anger consumed him, moments of happiness before California became Hawkins and Hawkins became hell. Something in those memories broke through, Billy's consciousness surfacing one final time with clarity and purpose. The sacrifice came as Billy placed himself between the Mind Flayer and 11, accepting the creature's attack meant for her. Tentacles pierced him repeatedly, the monster recognizing betrayal and responding with fury. Billy stood his ground, holding the creature's attention while others escaped. Max watched her stepbrother die, protecting the very people he'd once threatened and bullied, his final act redeeming years of cruelty born from pain. He looked at Max as life left him, perhaps seeking forgiveness or simply acknowledging the person she'd always been beneath his anger. Then he was gone. Joyce stood before the machine controls, Hopper beside her, the gate visible through observation windows. To close it, they needed to turn keys simultaneously, disrupting the magnetic field, keeping dimensional walls separated. The process would trigger chain reaction, potentially destroying the facility and everyone inside. Hopper nodded to Joyce, acceptance in his expression. They turned the keys together. The explosion that followed consumed the underground facility, flames erupting upward through access shafts and ventilation. Above the Mind Flayer's physical form dissolved as the gates sealed, its connection to the Upside Down severed once more. The creature's remains melted into inert organic matter, no longer animated by supernatural consciousness. The battle was won, but the cost was devastating. 30 people died in the mall battle. Soviet personnel perished in the facility's destruction, and Hopper was gone, apparently consumed in the blast that closed the gate. 3 months later, the buyer's family packed their belongings into a moving truck bound for California. 11, now Jim Hopper's legal daughter through paperwork, went with them. Joyce had decided Hawkins held too much trauma, too many memories of loss. Jonathan welcomed the fresh start. Will agreed from exhaustion, and Elle had nowhere else to go. In the Wheeler driveway, Mike and Elle exchanged tearful goodbyes, promising to visit for Thanksgiving and talk weekly by phone. The core group that had saved Hawkins repeatedly was fracturing, scattered across the country just when unity would become most crucial. Hopper was gone. Elle's powers were gone. The gate was closed. Yet in a Russian prison thousands of miles away, guards discussed feeding prisoners to a captive Demogorgon, the creature kept alive in a cage for purposes unclear. One prisoner earned special protection, referred to only as the American. The cell door remained closed, the prisoner's face unseen. Someone had survived who shouldn't have, and the implications would reach across continents. 8 months would pass before the scattered heroes learned how incomplete their victory had been. By March 1986, Hawkins had settled into uneasy peace, while its defenders faced new challenges across divided geography. In California, 11 struggled with powerlessness and high school cruelty. In Russia, Hopper survived through sheer determination and a sympathetic guard. In Hawkins itself, something ancient had awakened, something that killed through psychological torture and required neither gate nor government conspiracy to manifest its evil. The Byers household in Lenora Hills, California, represented Eleven's attempt at normal teenage life. She attended high school under the name Jane Hopper, wrote optimistic letters to Mike, describing friends and popularity she didn't actually possess, and endured systematic bullying from students who sensed her otherness. Angela and her circle mocked Eleven's awkward speech patterns, her second-hand clothes, and her general inability to navigate social hierarchies. Without powers to defend herself, Eleven faced vulnerability she'd never experienced even in the laboratory. The girl who defeated monsters couldn't stop teenagers from laughing at her presentation about Hopper's cabin. Will had grown his hair long and taken up painting, creating images that seemed to carry meanings he couldn't or wouldn't articulate. His artistic ability had always existed, but the extended work on a particular piece, a scene of friends battling a massive dragon, suggested significance beyond hobby. Jonathan had found friendship with Argyle, a perpetually stoned pizza delivery driver whose laid-back philosophy provided relief from years of crisis and responsibility. Joyce worked as a telemarketer, supporting the family while attempting to process grief that had no clear endpoint. Hopper's survival in the Kamchatka prison camp came through sheer stubbornness and unexpected alliance. The explosion at Starcourt hadn't killed him, but rather threw him near the Russian gate machine at the moment Joyce turned the keys. Soviet soldiers captured him, recognizing value in an American with knowledge of dimensional research. They transported him to Siberia, where prisoners labored in brutal conditions, and death came frequently from cold, exhaustion, or the Demogorgon the Russians kept caged for study. Dmitry Antonov, a guard with family he hoped to protect through wealth, offered Hopper an escape plan in exchange for payment that would need to come from Joyce. In Hawkins, the remaining friends had adapted to high school's different social pressures. Dustin and Mike joined the Hellfire Club, Hawkins High's Dungeons and Dragons organization, led by Eddie Munson, a senior whose theatrical personality and metalhead aesthetic made him simultaneously beloved by outcasts and despised by the popular crowd. Eddie's campaigns ran elaborate and challenging, his enthusiasm for the game infectious. Lucas had joined the basketball team, creating tension with his childhood friends, who saw this as betrayal or, at minimum, divided loyalty. His girlfriend Max had isolated herself following Billy's death, refusing therapy and pushing away those who tried to help. Steve and Robin worked at Family Video, their friendship having deepened into platonic intimacy, rare between opposite genders. Robin had confided her sexuality to Steve during the previous summer's Russian adventure, and he'd accepted this with grace that surprised them both. Nancy edited the school newspaper while dating Steve again, their relationship having rekindled after Jonathan's move to California created distance he seemed unwilling to bridge through communication. The deaths began with cheerleader Chrissy Cunningham, a girl whose perfect exterior concealed struggles with eating disorders and a psychologically abusive mother. She purchased drugs from Eddie Munson, seeking escape from headaches and visions that had plagued her for weeks. In Eddie's trailer, while he searched for the product she'd requested, Chrissy's visions intensified into waking nightmare. She rose into the air, limbs snapping at unnatural angles, eyes collapsing inward as something drained her essence. She died suspended against the ceiling, bones shattered, face destroyed. Eddie witnessed this impossibility and ran, understanding no one would believe his account and that a drug dealer present at a cheerleader's bizarre death would be convicted regardless of truth. The manhunt for Eddie Munson consumed Hawkins as basketball captain. Jason Carver organised his team into vigilante force. Jason had loved Chrissy, planned to marry her after graduation, and her death transformed him from confident athlete into something approaching zealot. He saw Eddie's involvement as proof of satanic conspiracy, the Hellfire Club's D&D games, as evidence of cult activity. His speeches inflamed existing prejudices against social outcasts, turning Eddie from eccentric into public enemy. The town's residents, already traumatized by years of unexplained incidents, embraced explanations that blamed human evil rather than supernatural forces. Dustin and Mike knew Eddie's character, understood he'd never harm anyone deliberately. They hid him in a boathouse at Lover's Lake, bringing food and updates while trying to understand what had actually killed Chrissy. Eddie recounted the incident with vivid terror, describing details that matched nothing in known reality. The girl had floated, he insisted. Her bones had broken from inside. Something invisible had torn her apart while he watched helplessly. His trauma was genuine, his confusion absolute. The second death followed similar pattern. Fred Benson, a student from the school newspaper who'd accompanied Nancy to investigate Chrissy's death, experienced escalating visions before dying at the trailer park. Nancy witnessed the aftermath, Fred's body displayed in the same grotesque manner. She recognized immediately that Eddie couldn't have committed both murders while in hiding. Something else was killing Hawkins' teenagers, and it selected victims based on criteria that wouldn't be obvious until more deaths revealed the pattern. Max had been experiencing symptoms identical to those that preceded the attacks: severe headaches, nosebleeds, and visions of things that shouldn't exist. She saw the grandfather clock from the old Creel house appearing in impossible locations, heard its chimes marking time towards something terrible. Her trauma from Billy's death, combined with guilt over her complicated feelings about his sacrifice, made her vulnerable to whatever entity was hunting. When she confessed these visions to her friends, they understood she would be the next target. The research into similar historical incidents led to Victor Creel, an inmate at Penhurst Psychiatric Hospital who'd been convicted of murdering his family in 1959. Victor claimed an evil presence had haunted their new home, driving his wife and daughter to madness before killing them. Only he and his son survived, though his son had fallen into permanent coma that eventually ended in death. Victor's account mentioned visions, headaches, and the sense of being watched by malevolent intelligence. The parallels to current deaths seemed too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Nancy and Robin gained access to Victor through carefully coordinated deception, posing as psychology students researching trauma. The old man's testimony, delivered with haunted certainty, described the demon that had tormented his family. Lights had flickered, animals had died, and each family member experienced personalized nightmares drawn from their deepest fears and guilts. His wife's visions concerned a baby that had died. His daughter saw things related to her mother's judgment. The entity fed on suffering before delivering death. The Creel house still stood at the edge of Hawkins, abandoned and decaying. The structure had gained reputation as haunted, teenagers occasionally daring each other to approach its overgrown yard. When the group investigated, they found lights flickering in response to presence from the upside down. The connection between the house, the historical murders, and current deaths suggested the killer originated from that location, perhaps had never truly left. Max's strategy for surviving her curse came from unexpected source. When the entity attacked, pulling her into nightmare visions constructed from her guilt and trauma, her friends couldn't reach her through normal means. Then Lucas remembered she'd been listening to Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill repeatedly, the song providing comfort through difficult months. They played it through her Walkman headphones at maximum volume. The music created anchor to reality, allowing Max to locate her consciousness and fight toward the light. She escaped the vision mere seconds before her bones would have snapped, collapsing back into her body on the edge of death. The discovery came through Max's near-death experience, Oritsaishur, the vision space where the entity had trapped her. She'd been suspended in its lair, a twisted version of the Creel house existing in the Upside Down. Other victims hung there as corpses, including Barb Holland from years before. The entity itself had appeared as humanoid figure, desiccated and vine-covered, with clawed hands and voice that spoke with eerie calm about the superiority of predators over prey. This was no mindless monster, but rather an intelligence that killed with purpose and philosophy. The group needed to understand what they faced, which required accessing the Upside Down itself. Steve volunteered to investigate a suspected gate at Lover's Lake, diving down to examine underwater phenomena Dustin's equipment had detected. Tendrils pulled him through, dragging him into the shadow dimension, where he immediately faced attack from demo bats, creatures that swarmed and bit chunks from his flesh. Nancy, Robin and Eddie followed him through the gate, rescuing him from the creatures through coordinated effort. The Upside Down they entered differed from what 11 and others had described from previous incursions. Nancy, seeking weapons she kept in her room, led them to the Wheeler house's shadow version and discovered something impossible. The Upside Down wasn't current, but rather frozen on November 6, 1983, the night Will had disappeared. Nancy's diary stopped on that date. Her room contained possessions from years before. The entire dimension existed, a snapshot of Hawkins from that specific moment, preserved in amber-like temporal stasis. This revelation transformed understanding of everything. The Upside Down wasn't simply alternate dimension, but rather a version of Hawkins locked at the exact moment when 11 had first torn open the gate. Time there had stopped, or perhaps had become meaningless, the dimension existing outside normal causality. The implications cascaded through every theory they'd constructed about the Shadow Realm, its creatures, and its relationship to their world. As March ended, the Hawkins crew had identified their enemy as something from the Upside Down, though not the Mind Flayer they'd fought before. This killer was surgical, personal, choosing victims based on trauma and guilt rather than random proximity. The Upside Down's freezing on November 6, 1983, suggested time itself worked differently there. But the most disturbing revelation awaited in memories 11 would soon recover, memories that would recontextualize everything she'd believed about her abilities, the laboratory, and the very source of the Upside Down's evil. The truth would prove more personal and more terrible than anyone imagined. In a secret facility in Nevada, 11 underwent an experimental procedure called the Nina Project. Dr. Brenner, impossibly alive despite his apparent death years before, orchestrated her power restoration through forced memory recovery. What 11 remembered would recontextualize everything she'd believed about her abilities, the laboratory, and the very source of the Upside Down's evil. The Nina Project used sensory deprivation, combined with psychotropic substances, to unlock repressed memories, forcing 11 to relive experiences her mind had buried for protection. She resisted initially, recognizing Brenner's manipulation and refusing to trust the man who'd raised her as experiment rather than daughter. Dr. Owens, present as government overseer, argued that restoring her powers was necessary to fight what threatened Hawkins. Without her abilities, the entity killing teenagers would continue unopposed. 11 entered the tank reluctantly, descending into memories she'd forgotten for reasons that would soon become devastatingly clear. The memory that surfaced took her back to September 8, 1979, a day that had begun ordinarily in the Rainbow Room, where numbered children played and trained under laboratory supervision. 11 had been younger then, less developed in power and understanding. The other children, designated 2 through 17, possessed various abilities of differing strengths. They competed for Brenner's attention and approval, social hierarchies forming among the experimental subjects, as they would in any group of confined adolescents. One child stood apart from these dynamics, a young orderly who cleaned the rooms and assisted with daily routines. Peter Ballard, the friendly orderly, had shown 11 kindness when others displayed cruelty or indifference. He spoke to her as person rather than number, encouraged her when training went poorly, and suggested that perhaps Brenner's methods weren't as benevolent as the children believed. Peter planted seeds of doubt about Papa's intentions, questioning whether the children were students or prisoners, whether their abilities would be used for protection or exploitation. Eleven trusted him because he offered what she desperately needed: validation that her instincts about wrongness were accurate. The massacre began in the Rainbow Room during what should have been routine training. 11 heard screams from down the corridor, sounds of violence and terror that sent staff fleeing. She emerged from her room to find blood on walls and floors, bodies of children she'd known scattered throughout the facility. 2's skull had been crushed, 5 had been twisted at impossible angles. The carnage continued through every corridor, every room where numbered children had lived and learned. Someone had systematically murdered them, all while 11 had been isolated and unaware. The memory of that day had been suppressed through trauma. 11's young mind unable to process the horror or her own role in what had occurred. She'd believed herself responsible, that her anger during training had somehow caused the deaths. Brenner had encouraged this belief, his manipulation extending to making her think she was a monster who destroyed everything she touched. The guilt had been foundational to her identity, the secret shame she carried beneath every subsequent action. The truth emerged as the memory continued beyond what 11 had previously allowed herself to recall. Peter Ballard had orchestrated the massacre, using abilities that far exceeded any other numbered child's power. He'd systematically hunted and killed the other children, eliminating them with cold efficiency. When he confronted 11 in the Rainbow Room's ruins, he revealed what Brenner had hidden. Peter was no ordinary orderly, but rather the first designated one, the most powerful subject ever discovered. More significantly, he was Henry Creel, the son who'd supposedly died in coma after murdering his family in 1959. Henry's history spilled out in his confession to young 11. He'd been born with abilities that manifested early, allowing him to sense and manipulate the minds of creatures around him. He'd started with animals, understanding their simple thoughts and bending them to his will. As his power grew, he'd attempted the same with his family, perceiving his mother's hidden thoughts and his sister's superficial concerns. When they'd resisted his intrusion, when his mother had sought help from doctors who would have institutionalized him, Henry had killed them all, staging the deaths as demonic attack. Brenner had recognized what Henry was during the investigation of the Creel murders. Rather than reporting him to authorities, Brenner had taken custody, seeing opportunity where others saw danger. For years, Brenner studied Henry, extracted his abilities through experimentation, and eventually created a system to suppress his powers while keeping him docile. The chip implanted in Henry's neck prevented him from accessing his full strength, reducing him to the harmless orderly who cleaned floors and emptied trash. This imprisonment had lasted decades, while Brenner used Henry's genetic material and methods to create additional subjects, the numbered children, who would never match the original's power. Henry's philosophy emerged through his monologue, a worldview shaped by isolation and perception of humanity as fundamentally corrupt. He saw civilization as cage, social structures as prisons limiting human potential. Predators and prey existed in natural order, and Henry identified himself as predator constrained by prey's rules. His vision for the world involved stripping away pretense and hierarchy, allowing chaos and power to determine survival. The Upside Down, he claimed, offered purity that the normal world lacked, a place where only strength mattered and weakness died appropriately. The manipulation of 11 into removing his power-suppressing chip represented Henry's final gambit. He'd befriended her, isolated her psychologically from the other children, and convinced her that freeing him would somehow serve justice. Young 11, trusting and desperate for ally against Brenner, had used her abilities to extract the device from Henry's neck. The moment his powers returned, Henry became something beyond human constraint. Decades of suppressed ability flooding back with multiplied intensity. The massacre that followed demonstrated Henry's philosophy through action. He killed every other child in the facility, absorbing or destroying their potential so no one could challenge him. He killed staff members who'd enabled Brenner's experiments. He intended to kill Brenner himself, but the doctor had fled during the chaos. Only 11 remained, the one who'd freed him and the only other subject whose power might rival his own. Henry intended to take her with him, to create new world together beyond society's constraints. 11 refused with force that surprised them both. Young as she was, terrified and alone, she fought back when Henry demanded compliance. Their psychic battle shattered walls and distorted reality around them, two immensely powerful minds colliding with physical consequences. 11 proved stronger in that moment, her desperation and rage exceeding Henry's cold calculation. She couldn't kill him, but she could banish him, her power tearing open a rift in space itself. The gateway 11 created in her fury and fear connected to dimension of decay and shadow. She hurled Henry through this rift, watching him fall into darkness beyond return. The monster that emerged in that void, transformed by the dimension's corruption, would become what the entity the children later named Vecna after their game's lich. Henry Creel, first subject, had become the Upside Down's true architect, his consciousness reshaping that dimension according to his nihilistic philosophy. The Mind Flayer itself might have been extension of Henry's will. Consciousness spread across impossible space and manifested as shadow creature of tentacles and malevolence. The revelation that 11 had created both the gate and the monster beyond it shattered her remaining certainty about her purpose and identity. She'd believed herself hero who'd closed gates and saved friends. Instead, she was the origin point of everything terrible that had happened to Hawkins. Will's disappearance, Barb's death, Bob's sacrifice, Billy's corruption, Hopper's apparent death, all of it traced back to the moment young 11 had banished Henry Creel into the Upside Down. Her existence had doomed the town she'd tried to protect. Dr. Brenner's death came shortly after these memories surfaced, government forces attacking the facility to eliminate evidence of the Nina project. Brenner, attempting to escape with 11, took bullets that left him dying in the desert. His final moments with 11 carried complexity rather than resolution. The man who tortured her, seeking forgiveness she couldn't grant. He'd called himself Papa, believed himself father figure, but had been captor who'd shaped her trauma and used her powers for purposes that created monsters. She left him without the absolution he sought, walking away from the man who'd defined her childhood toward friends who needed her regardless of her past mistakes. In Hawkins, the remaining crew had developed strategy based on information gathered from Max's near-death experience and the Upside Down's exploration. Vecna's physical body remained in the Creel house's shadow version, vulnerable while he projected consciousness to attack victims. If they could assault him physically while he was distracted psychically, they might wound or kill him before he completed his final ritual. Max volunteered as bait, offering herself as target to draw Vecna's attention, while others attacked his body in the Upside Down. The plan's complexity reflected their limited resources and desperate circumstances. Eddie and Dustin would remain in the Upside Down's trailer park, drawing away the demo bat swarms that protected Vecna's location. Steve, Nancy and Robin would enter the Creel house through the gate and attack Vecna with conventional weapons enhanced by fire and shells loaded with buckshot. Max would enter trance-like state in the real Hawkins, allowing Vecna to pull her into the vision where he delivered his curse. Lucas would stay with Max, ready to play music if she needed escape route. Erica would serve as lookout, warning if Jason's vigilante group approached. Eddie Munson's role in the plan brought him full circle from fugitive to defender. The young man who'd run from Chrissy's inexplicable death now stood ready to face creatures from nightmare dimensions. His speech to Dustin before the assault revealed his awareness of his own cowardice, the shame he carried from fleeing when perhaps he should have stayed to explain. This chance to be actually heroic, to protect rather than run, mattered to him more than survival. Dustin's protests that Eddie was already hero for sheltering them and maintaining hope went unheard. Eddie needed to prove something to himself. The execution began with Max's deliberate exposure. She sat in the Creel house's ruins in normal Hawkins, surrounded by her friends, and lowered her mental defences. Vecna sensed her immediately, his consciousness reaching across dimensions to pull her into the vision space he controlled. She found herself suspended in his lair, the throne room of twisted vines and floating victims, where he appeared as desiccated humanoid, with powers approaching godhood. He spoke to her about shared trauma, about Billy's death and her complicated guilt over feeling relief mixed with grief. Vecna's philosophy, delivered as Max suffered, revealed how deeply Henry Creel's childhood wounds had shaped his worldview. He saw suffering as humanity's natural state, and power as the only escape. His victims, he claimed, welcomed death as release from guilt and trauma they couldn't process. He was predator, removing the weak and damaged, creating selection pressure that would strengthen those who remained. Max's guilt over Billy made her perfect target, her youth and trauma, offering feast for the entity that fed on psychological suffering before killing. In the Upside Down, the assault team moved through shadows and decay toward the Creel house's dark version. Eddie's guitar distraction proved effective and theatrical, his performance of Metallica's Master of Puppets from atop his trailer drawing every demo bat in the vicinity. The creatures swarmed toward the music, allowing Steve's team to reach their target. Dustin and Eddie retreated into the trailer as planned, but the demo bats' numbers exceeded expectations. The thin barrier between them and monsters wouldn't hold long. The attack on Vecna's physical form came while his consciousness was occupied tormenting Max. Nancy fired shells directly into his body, Steve and Robin following with Molotov cocktails that engulfed him in flames. The creature screamed, his concentration broken, Max temporarily released from visions. They'd hurt him, perhaps badly, but not killed him. Vecna's body regenerated even as they watched, vines pulling him back together, wounds closing through supernatural resilience. Eddie's decision to cut his own escape route came from impulse rather than planning. He saw the demo bats breaking through their defences, recognised they would follow Dustin through the gate back to normal Hawkins. Rather than allow that, Eddie cut the rope connecting dimensions and drove his bicycle back toward the trailer park, drawing the swarm after himself. Dustin screamed at him to stop, to come back, that this wasn't part of the plan. Eddie smiled, said something about not running away this time, and faced the creatures alone. The demo bats overwhelmed Eddie through sheer numbers, their teeth finding flesh repeatedly despite his improvised shield and spear. He fought longer than seemed possible, taking down several creatures before injuries accumulated beyond recovery. When Dustin reached him, Eddie was dying, blood soaking his Hellfire Club shirt. Their final exchange carried weight beyond the words, Dustin insisting Eddie was hero, while Eddie died knowing he'd finally done something that mattered. The boy who'd been chased as murderer died as protector, his last stand buying seconds that might make difference elsewhere. 11 arrived in Hawkins through military transport, her powers partially restored through the Nina Project's trauma. She sensed Max's distress across distance and entered the fight psychically, projecting herself into Vecna's lair to battle him in the mental space where he was strongest. Their confrontation represented collision of creator and created, the girl who'd accidentally spawned the monster, and the monster who'd manipulated her childhood trauma. Vecna claimed they were alike, both damaged by Brenner, both powerful beyond normal human limits. 11 rejected this equivalence, understanding that power could serve protection or domination, and that choice defined everything. The battle between 11 and Vecna raged across multiple planes, psychic and physical, while Max suffered between them. Vecna had already begun breaking Max's limbs, her bones snapping audibly in the real world as Lucas held her screaming. 11's assault from the mental side disrupted, but didn't stop the process. Max's eyes collapsed inward, blood streaming from sockets. Her heart stopped, clinical death occurring as Vecna consumed the final piece of energy he needed. 4 gates opened simultaneously, tearing through Hawkins in massive rifts that converged on the town centre. The earth split along these scars, buildings collapsed into suddenly opened chasms, and the Upside Down's influence began bleeding into the normal world. Vecna had achieved his goal despite the assault, his 4 necessary kills completed with Max's death. The vision he'd described to Max of gates opening and dimensions merging was manifesting in real time. 11, refusing to accept Max's death, reached into her friend with powers she'd only recently recovered. She found Max's consciousness drifting, almost beyond reach, and pulled her back. Max's heart restarted, her breathing resumed, but something essential remained absent. Her body lived, but her mind had gone somewhere 11 couldn't follow. Max existed in coma, alive yet absent, her consciousness potentially trapped within Vecna, as the entity had hinted was possible. When 11 finally returned to Hawkins after weeks of separation, she found Mike, Will, Jonathan, and Argyle waiting at the buyer's ruined house. The reunion she'd longed for came amid devastation. Max lay comatose in hospital, alive but absent. Eddie Munson's name had been cleared posthumously, though not in time to save him. Jason Carver died when the gates opened, his zealotry ending in the chaos he'd helped create. Hawkins itself bore a massive wound, 4 rifts meeting in the centre of town, like scar on reality itself. The friends stood together, watching the Mind Flayers' storm gather over their broken hometown, understanding that Season 4 had been preparation, not conclusion. Vecna had survived the assault, retreating to recover, but not defeated. The gate stood open, barriers between dimensions, compromised in ways that might prove irreversible. Every previous victory had been temporary, buying time rather than achieving lasting peace. The real battle awaited, and this time there would be no closing doors or sealing rifts. This time, one side would need to be permanently destroyed. The journey from what we know to what we imagine begins with understanding where the story might lead. The most compelling theory emerging from Season 4's revelations centres on time itself as both weapon and solution. The Upside Down's peculiar stasis on November 6, 1983, the exact date of Will's disappearance, suggests temporal manipulation lies at the heart of Vecna's power, and potentially at the centre of how heroes might defeat him. This theory, supported by years of subtle foreshadowing, proposes that Season 5 will reveal time as the true battlefield. Nancy's discovery in the shadow version of her bedroom provided the first concrete evidence that something fundamental about time had broken. Her diary entries stopped on November 6, 1983. Her room contained sophomore year flashcards from years before. Every detail matched that specific night, frozen in dimensional amber, while the real world continued its progression through months and years. The question that emerged from this discovery carried implications beyond simple observation. Had the Upside Down always existed in temporal stasis, or had something about Will's kidnapping and 11's first gate opening locked that dimension at that moment? The grandfather clock that appeared to Vecna's victims throughout Season 4 represented more than atmospheric dread. Clocks measure time's passage, mark hours toward inevitable endings. Vecna's chosen symbol suggested his relationship to temporality extended beyond metaphor into actual manipulation. Each victim saw the clock in locations where it shouldn't exist, its chimes counting down toward death. The specificity of this imagery, combined with the frozen upside down, built framework for understanding Vecna's true nature as entity existing outside normal temporal flow. Netflix's official synopsis for Season 5 provided validation for theories that had circulated since the previous season's conclusion. The description stated that the crew must confront Vecna in a battle that spans dimensions and memories, while time itself unravels. This explicit reference to temporal instability moved speculation from fan theory into canonical text. The Duffer Brothers had confirmed that time would feature prominently in the final season's narrative, though the specific mechanisms remained deliberately vague. The episode titles released for Season 5 offered additional clues for those seeking temporal themes. The crawl as the season premiere suggested movement backward, possibly through time itself. The phrase evoked rewinding, the slow reversal of footage or perhaps events. Some theorists proposed the episode would literally show Season 1's opening moments replayed, Will's disappearance revisited with new context about what Vecna had been doing during that crucial night. Others suggested crawl referred to the slow approach of dimensional collapse, time moving at altered speed as reality destabilized. The right side up, as the finale title, generated the most intense speculation. The phrase mirrored upside down, while suggesting inversion or correction. Multiple interpretations competed for dominance in fan discussions. The optimistic reading proposed the right side up referred to reality restored after dimensional barriers were repaired, the normal world reasserting itself after years of supernatural incursion. The darker interpretation suggested transformation rather than restoration, the upside down remade into something new through temporal manipulation or sacrifice. Evidence for Vecna's temporal abilities extended beyond symbolic clocks and frozen dimensions. His apparent precognition during Season 4 battles suggested he perceived time non-linearly. He anticipated Nancy's plans before she executed them, understood strategies before they were fully formed. While this might be attributed to telepathy or tactical brilliance, the pattern suggested something more fundamental. Vecna existed partially outside sequential time, observing multiple possibilities simultaneously and acting on foreknowledge impossible for beings locked into linear causality. Eleven's revival of Max after clinical death raised questions about whether her powers had evolved beyond physical manipulation into temporal intervention. Max's heart had stopped. Her brain activity ceased. Medical science defined this as death. Yet 11 reached into that death and reversed it somehow. The standard interpretation held that she'd restarted biological processes through telekinetic manipulation of Max's physiology. The temporal theory proposed instead that 11 had rewound the few crucial seconds, undoing the damage before it became permanent. This distinction mattered significantly for understanding what powers might be possible in Season 5. The progression of 11's abilities across previous seasons supported the theory of continued evolution. She'd begun with simple telekinesis, moving objects through mental force. She'd developed the ability to access minds, reading thoughts and memories. She'd learned to project her consciousness across vast distances through the void. Each expansion built on previous capabilities while adding new dimensions of power. Temporal manipulation would represent the logical next step, moving beyond space into time itself, the final frontier for consciousness, unbound by physical limitations. The philosophical framework supporting temporal solutions drew from the series' established relationship between 11 and Vecna. They represented two sides of power's potential: protection versus domination. If Vecna's mastery extended to temporal manipulation, allowing him to exist partially outside time's flow, then 11's ultimate evolution would require matching that capability. The final battle might occur not in physical space, but across temporal dimensions, consciousness fighting consciousness across past, present, and potential futures simultaneously. The reset theory proposed the most radical interpretation of temporal themes. According to this speculation, the only way to truly defeat Vecna and seal dimensional rifts would be for 11 to rewind time itself, returning reality to a point before the gates opened and preventing the entire sequence of events. This would mean returning to November 6, 1983, and somehow stopping Will's kidnapping or preventing Eleven's first encounter with the Demogorgon. Such an ending would erase years of suffering, while simultaneously negating the friendships and growth that emerged from crisis. The emotional implications of timeline reset divided fan opinion sharply. On one hand, such an ending would restore lost lives. Barb would never die in Steve's pool. Bob would continue managing Radio Shack and loving Joyce. Eddie would never face accusations of murder. Max would retain her consciousness, her body never broken by Vecna's curse. Every sacrifice, every trauma, every loss would be unmade through temporal correction. The appeal of this outcome derived from the accumulated grief across 4 seasons of escalating stakes and permanent consequences. However, the narrative problems with complete reset were equally significant. Erasing established events would invalidate emotional investment audiences had made in character development and relationships. Eleven's growth from laboratory subject to autonomous person, Mike's evolution from awkward child to loyal boyfriend, Steve's transformation from self-absorbed teenager to protective guardian, all of these arcs would be undone if time reset to before the experiences that catalyzed change. The relationships forged through shared trauma would never form if the trauma never occurred. The bittersweet variation on reset theory suggested partial rather than complete temporal revision. 11 might rewind time to a crucial decision point, perhaps the moment she banished Henry Creel to the Upside Down, and make different choice that prevented his transformation into Vecna. This would alter subsequent events while preserving the general timeline, allowing character development to remain intact while preventing specific tragedies. The mechanics of such selective timeline editing remain deliberately vague in fan theories, recognizing that time travel's paradoxes rarely resolved cleanly in fiction. Alternative interpretations of the right side up focused on transformation rather than temporal manipulation. This theory proposed that the finale title referred to the Upside Down itself being changed, corrupted dimension, purified or destroyed completely. 11 might sacrifice herself not to reset time, but to collapse the shadow dimension entirely, eliminating the source of supernatural threats while remaining trapped within it as necessary anchor or guardian. This interpretation aligned with heroic sacrifice narratives while avoiding time travel complications. The evidence against timeline reset theories came primarily from the Duffer brothers themselves, who'd indicated in interviews that their ending would be bittersweet rather than cleanly happy. Complete temporal reset that restored every loss would lean toward pure happiness, the grief erased along with its causes. Bittersweet implied victory, achieved through permanent cost, success shadowed by loss that couldn't be undone. This suggested the timeline would remain intact, consequences of past decisions standing as foundation for whatever resolution emerged. The risk inherent in temporal storylines extended beyond narrative concerns into audience reception. Television history documented numerous examples of shows that attempted time travel or reality revision endings, often to catastrophic critical response. The "it was all a dream" revelation, while superficially similar to reset theories, earned particular derision for invalidating investment in events revealed as imaginary. Stranger Things would need to avoid these pitfalls if incorporating temporal themes, ensuring that any time manipulation felt earned rather than convenient. The symbolic resonance of time as final challenge aligned with the series' progression through increasingly abstract threats. Season 1's Demogorgon represented straightforward, physical danger, a monster that could be fought and killed through conventional means enhanced by Eleven's powers. The Mind Flayer introduced hive consciousness and possession, threats operating on psychological rather than purely physical level. Vecna combined physical, psychological, and dimensional elements into being that existed partially outside normal reality. Time represented the ultimate abstraction, the framework containing all other forms of existence and the final frontier for consciousness to manipulate. The thematic appropriateness of temporal conclusion stemmed from the series' foundational moment. Everything began on November 6, 1983, with Will's disappearance and Eleven's escape. That date had haunted the narrative across all subsequent seasons, referenced repeatedly as the origin point from which all supernatural events flowed. The Upside Down's freezing on that specific date suggested it held significance beyond coincidence. Returning to that moment, whether literally through time travel or symbolically through understanding what truly occurred, would provide narrative symmetry that respected the story's architecture. The question of whether Eleven possessed the raw power necessary for temporal manipulation remained deliberately ambiguous in fan theories. Her abilities had always exceeded Brenner's understanding and potentially her own comprehension. The Nina Project had revealed that her power stemmed from her rejection of Henry Creel, her refusal to accept his philosophy of domination. This suggested her capabilities derived from moral conviction as much as inherent talent, while channeling ability in ways that surpassed purely technical skill. If defeating Vecna required temporal intervention, Eleven's determination might prove sufficient even if her training remained incomplete. The time manipulation theory offered elegant solutions to established mysteries, while creating new narrative possibilities. Whether the right side up represented a transformed dimension, a reset timeline, or something entirely unexpected, the theory's foundation rested on years of careful foreshadowing. Time, which had haunted the series since November 6, 1983, might prove to be both the curse and cure. The frozen upside down represented temporal anchor, point from which all subsequent events derived. Understanding and potentially manipulating that anchor could provide the key to victory, allowing heroes to fight Vecna on the fundamental level where his power originated, rather than merely responding to its manifestations in physical reality. Understanding temporal mechanics matters little, however, without understanding the person whose connection to the Upside Down predates even Eleven's birth. From the series' very first moments, Will Byers has been central to Hawkins' supernatural troubles, yet despite being the catalyst, he's often been sidelined in favour of more powerful characters. The Duffer Brothers have promised Will be a huge player in Season 5. Evidence suggests his role extends far beyond victim into territory that might reveal him as the key to everything. The one person whose connection to the Upside Down predates Vecna's arrival there, and whose survival might have been the variable Vecna never anticipated. Will's disappearance on November 6, 1983 initiated the entire narrative, but the circumstances surrounding that night have never been fully explained. The Demogorgon targeted him specifically, pursuing him through the woods with apparent intent rather than random predation. When it finally cornered him in the shed, the creature took Will alive rather than killing him immediately, as it had done with other victims. This deviation from established behaviour suggested purpose. The Demogorgon, acting as Vecna's instrument, whether consciously or through dimensional connection, wanted Will for reasons that transcended simple feeding. The week Will spent in the Upside Down represented unprecedented survival. No other person had endured such extended exposure to that dimension's toxic atmosphere and constant threats. Barb died within hours, Other victims across subsequent seasons lasted minutes at most before being killed or consumed. Will survived 7 days, communicating with his mother through Christmas lights, evading monsters and maintaining enough presence of mind to provide information about his location. This resilience suggested something inherent to Will's nature, some quality that allowed him to withstand conditions that should have been rapidly fatal. The lingering connection between Will and the Upside Down persisted across every subsequent season, manifesting in ways that went beyond simple trauma or dimensional contamination. In Season 2, the Mind Flayer specifically targeted Will for possession, despite numerous other potential hosts being available. The entity connected to Will first, using his established link to the shadow dimension as pathway for invasion. When Joyce and others attempted to sever this connection through heat and isolation, the Mind Flayer fought desperately to maintain its hold on this particular boy, rather than simply abandoning him for easier prey. Will's neck tingles, the physical sensation that warned him when the Upside Down's influence was near, continued even after the Mind Flayer's apparent defeat. In Season 3, while other characters remained oblivious to dimensional proximity, Will sensed the Mind Flayer's return before any visible evidence emerged. This sensitivity operated like supernatural radar, detecting the Upside Down's presence across dimensional barriers. The ability proved remarkably precise, distinguishing between general unease and specific supernatural threat. Such sensitivity required more than lingering contamination from exposure. It suggested fundamental attunement between Will and the shadow dimension. The theory of Will possessing dormant supernatural abilities builds from these accumulated observations. Vecna, as Henry Creel, had demonstrated that psychic powers could manifest in children without laboratory intervention. His abilities emerged naturally during childhood, allowing him to perceive and manipulate minds around him, long before Brenner discovered and studied him. If naturally occurring psychic abilities existed in the world, independent of governmental experimentation, then other children might possess similar gifts without realizing their nature or extent. Will's artistic ability, highlighted repeatedly across seasons, might represent supernatural perception rather than purely aesthetic talent. The concept of true sight from Dungeons and Dragons refers to the ability to see through illusions and perceive reality as it truly exists. In the game, this rare power allows characters to detect disguised creatures, see invisible entities, and recognize magical effects that fool normal senses. Applied to Will's situation, true sight would explain his artistic visions as perceptions of actual supernatural reality translated through visual medium he could consciously access. The painting Will created throughout Season 4 carried significance beyond symbolic gesture or gift for friends. The image depicted the party as heroes, specifically showing them battling a massive red dragon. Will presented this to Mike during their reunion, offering it as representation of their friendship and shared adventures. The dragon imagery aligned with Dungeons and Dragons conventions, but fan theories proposed the painting might function as prophecy rather than retrospective illustration. Will the Wise, his D&D character, served as cleric or wizard depending on campaign, roles associated with divination and foresight. His painting might depict not past victories, but future battles. The dragon in Will's artwork bore resemblance to the Mind Flayer's shadow form as seen in Season 2's finale. The massive creature looming over Hawkins with tentacles spreading across the sky. If Will's artistic visions carried prophetic weight, then the painting suggested Season 5 would feature the party confronting this entity directly rather than fighting through its proxies and possessed servants. The specificity of the image, combined with Will's history of upside-down connection, elevated the painting from fan service to potential plot device. Joyce Byers' possible connection to the Hawkins laboratory experiments provided another layer to theories about Will's abilities. the MKUltra program that had produced Terry Ives and presumably other test subjects remained incompletely explored in the series canon. Joyce's intense intuition, her ability to sense Will's presence across dimensional barriers, and her immediate conviction that unconventional methods would work when others insisted on rational explanations, all suggested familiarity with supernatural phenomena that went beyond maternal instinct. The theory that Joyce had participated in early MKUltra experiments, escaping before full conditioning occurred, would explain numerous oddities about her character and situation. Her apparently irrational certainty during Season 1 that Will remained alive and could be contacted would reframe as suppressed knowledge of dimensional research surfacing under crisis. Her comfort with unconventional communication methods, the Christmas light system she devised without scientific training, suggested unconscious understanding of how dimensional barriers functioned. If Joyce had been exposed to experiments studying consciousness and dimensional perception, residual abilities might have passed genetically to her sons. This genetic inheritance theory proposed that Will's connection to the Upside Down existed before the Demogorgon's arrival, lying dormant until activated by proximity to dimensional rifts. Vecna, perceiving supernatural potential through his own abilities, would have recognized Will as valuable resource during the initial gate opening. Rather than random victim selection, Will's kidnapping represented strategic acquisition of person whose latent abilities might serve Vecna's purposes. The exact nature of those purposes remained speculative, but possibilities ranged from using Will as dimensional anchor to attempting to corrupt his abilities for use against 11. Noah Schnapp's comments in interviews about Will's importance in Season 5 lent credibility to theories of expanded role beyond continued victimization. Schnapp emphasized that Will's arc would finally receive the development and resolution it deserved after seasons of being sidelined or supporting others' storylines. For an actor to make such statements suggested substantial script material centered on his character, plotlines that wouldn't simply repeat previous patterns of Will suffering while others rescued him. The potential for direct psychic confrontation between Will and Vecna carried thematic resonance beyond tactical advantage. Will represented everything Vecna claimed to despise about humanity, the weakness and vulnerability that Henry Creel had rejected when embracing predator philosophy. Yet Will's survival through circumstances that killed others, his resilience despite lacking superhuman powers or combat training, demonstrated strength that Vecna's worldview couldn't accommodate. A confrontation between them would test competing philosophies about what constituted true power and whether survival required domination or connection. Will's sexuality subplot developed gradually across seasons through subtext and Noah Schnapp's confirmed interpretation, added emotional stakes to his potential heroism. Will's feelings for Mike, his struggle with identity and acceptance while literally fighting for survival against supernatural threats, created layered character complexity. His journey towards self-acceptance paralleled the larger narrative of confronting darkness, internal and external demons requiring similar courage to face. Season 5's resolution of Will's character arc would need to address both dimensions of his struggle, validating his identity while allowing him heroic agency in the supernatural conflict. The possibility of Will possessing powers comparable to 11's, perhaps manifesting under crisis conditions in Season 5, would vindicate fan investment in a character who'd been defined primarily through suffering. Discovering that Will the Wise wasn't merely nickname, but accurate description of supernatural perception would reframe every previous season. His visions in Season 2 wouldn't be simple mind flayer possession, but rather forced awakening of dormant abilities. His artistic works wouldn't be therapeutic expression, but documentation of actual supernatural sight. His survival in the Upside Down wouldn't be luck, but unconscious use of abilities he didn't know he possessed. The Montauk Project connections, references to the real-world conspiracy theory that had inspired Stranger Things' original title, suggested the series might return to these roots in its conclusion. The Montauk Project allegedly involved experiments in time travel, psychological warfare, and dimensional manipulation conducted at Camp Hero in New York. While the conspiracy theory lacked credible evidence, its narrative elements had clearly influenced the show's mythology. Will's potential connection to these deeper conspiratorial layers might reveal that Hawkins Laboratories' experiments represented only surface level of governmental supernatural research extending back decades. The number 7, significant in Stranger Things mythology through Bridget Wenlock's theorem about magical properties, might apply to Will's survival and abilities. 7 days in the Upside Down. 7 as the number of completion or perfection in numerous cultural traditions. If Will's exposure had somehow attuned him to dimensional frequencies in ways calculated rather than accidental, his emergence might have been timed precisely to create specific supernatural resonance. This numerological approach to Will's importance strayed into speculative territory, but aligned with the series' established interest in symbolic numbers and patterns. Will's consistent positioning as observer rather than actor across previous seasons, while frustrating for character development, might have been intentional preparation for final season revelation. By keeping him peripheral to main action, the show preserved his potential while developing other characters. His true importance, hidden in plain sight, would emerge only when narrative demanded it. This delayed payoff required patience from audiences, but promised greater impact when finally delivered. The boy who started everything would end everything, his role transforming from catalyst to active agent in ways that honoured both his suffering and his strength. The theory that Will might need to sacrifice himself, entering the Upside Down permanently to seal dimensional barriers from within, offered darker interpretation of his ultimate significance. His unique connection to that dimension, developed across years of exposure and attack, might make him the only anchor capable of maintaining separation between realities. Such an ending would give Will agency while acknowledging the costs of heroism, his voluntary choice to protect others, requiring permanent exile from the world he'd fought to remain part of. This bittersweet possibility aligned with the Duffer Brothers' stated intentions while providing Will with heroic conclusion that transcended victim status. Will Byers began as victim and might end as victor, his victimhood transformed into unique advantage. His survival where others perished, his connection where others were spared, his sensitivity where others remained blind, all point toward a role that makes narrative, thematic, and emotional sense. The boy who was lost might be the one who shows everyone else the way home. His painting, his visions, his persistent presence despite every attempt to eliminate or corrupt him, suggested a character whose importance extended beyond what any single theory could encompass. Season 5 would need to honour Will's journey while delivering on promises implicit in making him the series' original mystery. While Will represents survival against possession, another character faces a fate that might prove darker than death itself. Max Mayfield ended Season 4 in a state worse than death. Her body breathed, but her mind had vanished, trapped somewhere unreachable, even by 11's psychic searching. Her last words before clinical death, "I can't see anything, I can't feel anything," suggest her consciousness exists in sensory deprivation, more complete than any isolation tank. The theory that haunts many fans proposes Max's mind resides inside Vecna, and that the final battle might force 11 to kill her best friend to save the world. The medical specifics of Max's condition provided foundation for theories about her consciousness's location. Her heart had stopped beating for over a minute, clinical death by standard definition. Brain activity had ceased during that interval, the flat line indicating no electrical impulses firing across neural pathways. 11's intervention had restarted Max's heart and restored basic autonomic functions, the breathing and circulation that maintained biological life. Yet Max herself remained absent, her consciousness unreachable through both medical and supernatural means. 11's inability to locate Max in the void carried particular significance for understanding what had occurred. The void, that black psychic space where 11 projected her consciousness to find distant people, had always functioned reliably when the target person remained alive. She'd found Max there numerous times, sensed her presence, and accessed her thoughts. Following Max's revival, 11 searched the void desperately and found nothing. Max didn't register in the psychic space, where all living minds created detectable presence. This absence suggested Max's consciousness existed somewhere outside normal reality, displaced to location 11's powers couldn't access. Dr. Brenner's explanation of how Vecna killed his victims, delivered during 11's memory recovery sessions, provided crucial context. Vecna didn't simply break bodies and destroy flesh. He consumed essence, taking something fundamental from his victims that went beyond physical life. Their memories, their fears, their entire psychological existence became absorbed into Vecna himself. The victims 11 had seen suspended in Vecna's lair existed as more than corpses. They remained present in some form, their consciousness trapped within the entity that had killed them. The theory that Max's consciousness resided inside Vecna's mind drew support from what she'd experienced during her near-death encounter. When Vecna pulled her into his vision space, she'd found herself in his lair surrounded by his previous victims. Barb Holland hung there among others, recognizable despite years having passed since her death. These weren't simply bodies displayed as trophies, but rather something more disturbing. Consciousness preserved and contained within Vecna's psychological architecture. Max had escaped before full consumption, but the process had begun. Visual evidence from Season 4's finale suggested Max's presence within Vecna persisted even after 11's intervention. Careful viewers noted what appeared to be Max's face flickering within Vecna's form during certain shots, her features briefly visible within the creature's desiccated flesh before disappearing again. While potentially attributable to editing or visual effects choices without narrative significance, the imagery supported theories that Max existed trapped inside the entity, her consciousness absorbed, but not yet fully destroyed or integrated. The possession theory extended this concept into darker territory. If Max's consciousness resided inside Vecna while her body lay comatose in Hawkins Hospital, what would prevent Vecna from using that body as vessel? Max's flesh remained alive, maintained by medical equipment and 11's desperate intervention, but the animating consciousness had departed, leaving empty form. Vecna, whose own physical body had been severely damaged during the Season 4 assault, might find Max's available body too valuable to ignore. Possessing her would provide him mobility in the physical world while keeping her consciousness imprisoned within his own mind. The nightmare scenario of 11 forced to fight Vecna inhabiting Max's body represented storytelling at its most emotionally devastating. The parallel to Anakin Skywalker's transformation into Darth Vader, where the hero's loved one became the villain requiring defeat, suggested itself immediately. Star Wars had explored this territory through Luke's need to redeem his father rather than simply destroy him. Stranger Things might pursue similar themes but with more tragic outcome. 11. Discovering that saving Max required killing the body that contained her. The acting challenge such a storyline would present to Sadie Sink added another layer to speculation. Sink had delivered remarkable performance as Max suffered throughout Season 4, her portrayal of grief, trauma, and determination earning critical praise. Playing Max's body possessed by Vecna would require an entirely different approach, maintaining recognizable physical presence while embodying alien consciousness. Sync possessed demonstrated range for such complex work, but the material would test any performer's capabilities while potentially providing career-defining showcase. The friendship between Eleven and Max, developed across seasons 2 through 4, provided emotional foundation that would make this conflict unbearable. They'd begun as rivals competing for Mike's attention, Max suspicious of Eleven's powers, and Eleven jealous of Max's normalcy. Their relationship had evolved through shared experiences into genuine friendship, Max teaching Eleven about teenage life, while Eleven offered acceptance without judgment. By season 3, they'd become close enough for shopping trips and honest conversations about relationships. Season 4 had deepened this bond further, Eleven understanding Max's suicidal ideation, while Max appreciated having someone who'd also experienced loss. The specific memories they shared would haunt any confrontation between Eleven and Vecna as Max. The mall shopping montage from season 3, soundtracked by pop music and feminine bonding, represented their friendship at its most joyful. Max's letter writing throughout season 4, her preparation for anticipated death, had included message for Eleven, expressing gratitude for their friendship. These moments of connection would be weaponized by Vecna, the entity using Max's form and memories to psychologically torment Eleven during their battle. Alternative interpretations of Max's situation offered slightly less tragic possibilities. Rather than Vecna possessing Max's body, the theory proposed that Eleven might enter Vecna's mind to rescue Max's trapped consciousness. This would require Eleven to project herself into the entity's psychological space, navigating his memories and victims to locate Max and extract her. The risk of such a mission would be substantial, Eleven potentially becoming trapped herself if she couldn't maintain connection to her own body while infiltrating Vecna's consciousness. The precedent for such a rescue existed in Season 3's confrontation with the Mind Flayer possessing Billy. Eleven had entered Billy's mind, accessing memories of his childhood to remind him of identity beyond possession. She'd broken through the Mind Flayer's control temporarily, allowing Billy's consciousness to surface and make heroic choice in his final moments. A similar approach with Max might prove successful, though the circumstances differed significantly. Billy had been possessed by an external entity. Max's consciousness existed trapped within that entity, a more complex arrangement requiring more sophisticated extraction. The concern about repeating Infinity War's Soulstone scene, where characters accessed liminal space to retrieve loved ones, suggested awareness of similar narratives in recent popular media. The Marvel film had shown characters entering orange-tinted void space to communicate with those caught between life and death. If Stranger Things pursued Mind Palace rescue of Max, visual and narrative distinctions would need to clearly separate it from this recent precedent. The Upside Down's aesthetic, with its decay and darkness, provided different atmosphere, but thematic similarities would remain challenging to navigate without appearing derivative. The thematic significance of Eleven potentially needing to kill Max extended beyond shock value into examination of heroism's costs. Eleven had spent 4 seasons protecting her friends, using her powers to save them from threats both supernatural and mundane. Her entire identity had been constructed around being protector, the one with abilities sufficient to defend those she loved. If circumstances forced her to kill Max to stop Vecna, it would represent ultimate corruption of her protective role, success defined by destroying what she'd fought to preserve. The question of whether Eleven could psychologically survive such an act, regardless of its necessity, raised concerns about the series' final message. Eleven had already suffered extraordinary trauma throughout her young life. Abuse from Brenner, social isolation, repeated near-death experiences, and the burden of others' survival resting on her abilities. Adding fratricide, even in service of saving the world, might push her beyond realistic recovery. The show had generally avoided nihilistic conclusions, despite dark subject matter. Forcing Eleven to kill Max risked crossing into bleakness that would undermine the hope and friendship themes that had defined the series. Max's own wishes, expressed through her letter writing and conversations throughout Season 4, provided ethical framework for considering her potential death. She'd been prepared to die during the Vecna confrontation, accepted it as necessary sacrifice to give others chance to attack the entity. Her letter to Eleven had explicitly addressed not wanting her friend to blame herself if the plan failed. This advance permission didn't eliminate the moral weight of killing her, but it suggested Max herself would prefer death to continued imprisonment within Vecna's consciousness if no rescue proved possible. The alternative outcome, where Max's consciousness remained permanently trapped while her body recovered, offered different kind of tragedy. 11 might restore Max to physical functionality, her body healing and eyes opening, only to discover that the person operating that body was no longer Max. The resulting existence would be horrifying in its own right, neither fully alive nor properly dead, consciousness exiled while flesh continued its processes. Such a fate might prove worse than clean death, permanent limbo without possibility of peace or resolution. Sadie Sink's and Millie Bobby Brown's performances during Season 4's finale, where Max died and 11 desperately tried to save her, demonstrated the emotional intensity both actors could bring to their characters' relationship. Brown's anguished screaming as she reached into death to retrieve her friend, Sink's physical commitment to portraying Max's broken body, both suggested the actresses understood the stakes and could deliver material of corresponding weight. If Season 5 required them to play out tragedy of friendship destroyed by Vecna's manipulation, they possessed proven capability for such demands. The fan community's response to theories about Max's fate revealed how successfully the show had made audiences care about character who'd been introduced only in Season 2. The passionate advocacy for Max's survival, the detailed theories about how her consciousness might be rescued, and the emotional rejection of scenarios requiring her permanent death or continued suffering, all demonstrated her importance to viewers. This investment created pressure on the writers to handle her fate with care, balancing narrative demands against audience attachment. The parallel to 11 saving Billy in Season 3 created expectations that similar last-minute redemption might be possible for Max. Billy had seemed beyond rescue, fully consumed by the Mind Flayer's will, until 11 accessed his deepest memories and reminded him of love and identity. If 11 could reach Billy through layers of possession and corruption, perhaps she could reach Max through whatever barriers separated them. This hope sustained many fans through the hiatus between seasons, faith that the pattern of 11th hour salvation would hold one more time. However, the narrative requirement for permanent stakes suggested that not every endangered character could receive miraculous rescue. The series had been criticised for protecting main cast members despite increasing dangers, fake-outs like Hopper's, apparent death undermining tension when audiences learned to expect survival. Max's situation offered opportunity to establish genuine consequences, demonstrating that heroism sometimes failed and losses accumulated beyond recovery. Her potential permanent death or continued imprisonment would signal that Season 5 intended to commit to its darkest implications rather than pulling back at the last moment. Max's fate represents one of Season 5's most emotionally charged mysteries. Whether her consciousness can be recovered, whether her body might become enemy territory, or whether her sacrifice will stand as permanent loss, the outcome will profoundly affect Eleven's character and the series' willingness to embrace truly tragic consequences. Max deserves better than the suffering she's endured, having lost her stepbrother, her sense of safety, and finally her very consciousness to forces beyond her control. Whether she'll receive resolution that honours her strength and friendship, or whether her story ends in continued darkness, remains the question that might break fans' hearts regardless of answer. Max's potential sacrifice leads inevitably to questions about another possible loss, one that has haunted the series since its beginning. From the moment Eleven disappeared after destroying the Demogorgon in Season 1, death has shadowed her character. Each season threatens to take her, only to pull back at the last moment. However, mounting evidence suggests Season 5 might finally commit to the sacrifice the series has foreshadowed since its beginning. The theory that Eleven will die, or accept some form of permanent separation from the life she loves, carries weight both narratively and thematically, representing the completion of a hero's journey that began with a girl who barely understood her own humanity. The pattern of near-deaths across previous seasons established rhythm that audiences have learned to recognize and distrust. Season 1 ended with Eleven apparently disintegrating alongside the Demogorgon, her sacrifice appearing final until the closing scene revealed Hopper leaving Egos in the woods. Season 3 culminated with her losing powers after overexertion, a symbolic death of her superhuman identity. Season 4 pushed her to complete exhaustion, fighting Vecna, blood streaming from her eyes and nose as she struggled to maintain consciousness. Each time she survived through combination of will and narrative protection. Yet this repeated pattern of survival created what storytellers call diminishing returns. Audiences began to expect Eleven's resurrection, to anticipate that any apparent death would be reversed through some mechanism. The fake-outs became predictable, undermining tension that should accompany life-threatening situations. For Season 5 to restore genuine stakes, it would need to commit to consequences rather than continuing the pattern of last-minute salvation. Eleven's death, if it occurs, would need to be permanent and meaningful rather than another temporary setback. The thematic necessity of Eleven's potential sacrifice stemmed from the fundamental conflict at the series' heart. She existed as living weapon, created through abuse and experimentation to serve purposes she hadn't chosen. Her entire arc across 4 seasons involved claiming autonomy, transforming from numbered subject into person named Jane, with friends, family, and identity independent of her abilities. The ultimate expression of that autonomy would be choosing her own fate, deciding that her powers should be used to protect others, even if such use required her death. The specific mechanism of Eleven's potential sacrifice remained deliberately vague in fan theories, but most centered on the concept of closing dimensional rifts permanently. The gates between Hawkins and the Upside Down had been opened, closed, and reopened multiple times across the series. Each closure proved temporary, the dimensional barriers remaining weakened and vulnerable to future breaches. Truly permanent separation might require anchor or guardian positioned at the threshold. Consciousness powerful enough to maintain the seal through continuous effort. Eleven's abilities uniquely qualified her for such a role. The alternative to literal death involved exile rather than extinction. This variation proposed Eleven might need to remain in the Upside Down permanently, her presence there necessary to prevent Vecna's return or to maintain dimensional separation. She would live, but be forever separated from Mike, Hopper, and the others she'd come to love. This fate carried its own tragedy, life without the connections that gave it meaning. The Lord of the Rings parallel suggested itself, Frodo surviving his quest but being too damaged to remain in the Shire, sailing to the Grey Havens in ending that mixed relief with profound loss. Mike's reaction to Eleven's death or permanent exile would test the relationship that had anchored both characters since Season 1. His promise to go crazy together assumed a shared future, growing up and growing old with each other. Losing Eleven would shatter that assumption, forcing Mike to construct meaning from life without the person who defined his adolescence. The emotional devastation such loss would cause reflected the depth of their connection, love demonstrated through grief rather than happy ending. Millie Bobby Brown's demonstrated acting range suggested she could deliver performance of appropriate weight for tragic conclusion. Her work across previous seasons had shown remarkable maturity, portraying complex emotions with subtlety and power. The season 4 scene where she desperately tried to save Max, screaming and crying while reaching into death itself, demonstrated Brown's capability for raw emotional intensity. If the script required her to play Eleven's acceptance of necessary sacrifice to convey understanding that love sometimes meant letting go, Brown possessed proven ability to make such material resonate. The cast members' comments in interviews provided circumstantial evidence that major deaths awaited in Season 5. Gaten Matarazzo had suggested that characters would die, his tone indicating genuine stakes rather than fake-outs. Millie Bobby Brown had spoken about the ending's emotional impact, describing it as devastating in ways that seemed to exceed typical promotional hyperbole. Maya Hawke had similarly indicated that the finale would deliver on accumulated tension rather than offering easy resolution. These statements, while carefully avoiding spoilers, created expectation that Season 5 would embrace consequences previous seasons had deferred. The Duffer Brothers' descriptions of the ending as bittersweet provided additional framework for speculation. Purely happy conclusions, where all heroes survived and evil was permanently defeated without cost, rarely earned that particular adjective. Bittersweet implied victory shadowed by loss, success achieved through sacrifice that couldn't be undone. This tonal description suggested the timeline would remain intact, past losses standing as permanent rather than being erased through temporal manipulation. It also implied that final victory would require giving up something precious, possibly someone precious. The Harry Potter parallel offered both template and warning for Eleven's potential sacrifice. J.K. Rowling's protagonist had walked willingly to his death, accepting mortality as necessary to defeat Voldemort. The crucial difference was Harry's resurrection, the magical mechanics allowing him to survive his sacrifice and return to life. Stranger Things possessed no established precedent for such resurrection, no Horcruxes or Mother's protection that might allow 11 to die and return. If she died, it would likely be permanent, making the sacrifice more absolute than Harry's ultimately reversible death. The Matrix provided another cultural touchstone, Neo dying to end the war between humans and machines. That sacrifice had been unambiguous, the character's death serving as catalyst for peace, rather than being reversed through narrative convenience. The parallel resonated because Neo, like 11, possessed powers that set him apart from normal humans, chosen one whose abilities made him uniquely capable of ending the conflict. His death validated that specialness, while demonstrating that being special didn't grant immunity from mortality's demands. Hopper's apparent death in Season 3, later revealed as survival and imprisonment, created complications for theories about Eleven's fate. The fake-out had angered some fans who felt manipulated by the emotional manipulation of believing Hopper dead only to learn he'd survived. If the show repeated this pattern with 11, having her appear to die only to be revealed alive in some post-credits sequence or sequel setup, the criticism would likely be severe. The series would need to either commit fully to her death or find alternative that didn't feel like retreading previous narrative beats. The impact on Mike's character development provided another lens for examining Eleven's potential death. Mike had grown from awkward child into loyal protector, his relationship with 11 driving much of his maturation. Losing her would force him to find identity and purpose independent of that relationship, to discover who Mike Wheeler was without 11 as defining presence. This character work, while painful, might represent necessary evolution, adolescent love transforming into adult grief and eventual acceptance. The found family theme that had sustained the series across 4 seasons would be fundamentally tested by Eleven's death. The group had formed around protecting each other, their bonds strengthened through shared trauma and repeated rescue missions. If one member couldn't be saved, if their collective strength proved insufficient to prevent loss, it would acknowledge limits to friendship's power. This more mature perspective might provide appropriate culmination for series that had followed its characters from childhood toward adulthood. The philosophical question of whether one life could be worth saving the world had been explored extensively in science fiction and fantasy. Utilitarian calculus suggested that sacrificing one person to save thousands or millions was ethically justified, even required. Yet such calculations ignored the lived reality of loss, the specific grief experienced by those who loved the sacrificed individual. Eleven's death would force characters and audiences to confront this tension, to acknowledge both the necessity of sacrifice and its unbearable human cost. The alternative interpretation, that Eleven might sacrifice her powers rather than her life, offered slightly less tragic outcome. This variation proposed that closing the dimensional rifts permanently would drain her abilities entirely, leaving her alive but ordinary. Jane Hopper would continue existing, while Eleven, the superhuman, disappeared. She'd remain with Mike and Hopper, but would never again access the powers that had defined her. This loss of identity, while allowing survival, carried its own melancholy. The hero forced to become normal, when normalcy had never been an available option before. The concern about whether Eleven could psychologically survive the accumulated trauma of 4 seasons, even if she lived physically, suggested that death might represent mercy rather than tragedy. She'd been abused as child, used as weapon, forced to kill, lost friends and father figures, and carried guilt for events beyond her control. The weight of these experiences might prove too much for any person, even one with supernatural abilities. Perhaps peace could only come through ending, release from burdens too heavy for continued carrying. The symbolism of Eleven's potential death connected to broader themes about childhood ending and adult responsibilities beginning. The series had followed its young protagonists from bikes and D&D campaigns through first romances and complex moral choices. Eleven's journey from laboratory subject to autonomous person paralleled the general movement from innocence toward experience. Her death, if it occurred, would represent the ultimate loss of innocence, the moment when childhood's protective narratives shattered completely against adult reality of permanent consequences. The question of redemption, whether Eleven needed to die to atone for creating the gate that caused so much suffering, divided fan opinion. Some argued she bore no guilt, having been a frightened child manipulated by Brenner when she banished Henry Creel. Others suggested that regardless of culpability, she might feel responsible and seek to balance cosmic scales through sacrifice. The distinction between objective guilt and subjective responsibility mattered less than what Eleven herself believed, her own judgment determining whether death felt like atonement or simply necessity. The timing of potential sacrifice raised additional considerations. If Eleven died early in Season 5, the remaining episodes would explore aftermath and characters attempting to complete the mission without her. This structure would emphasize that victory required collective effort rather than single hero's power. If she died in the finale, her sacrifice would be climactic, the culmination of her arc and the action that secured victory. Each approach carried different narrative advantages and emotional impacts. The visual representation of Eleven's death, should it occur, would need to avoid repeating the disintegration effect from Season 1. Audiences had seen her dissolve into particles once already. Repeating that imagery would feel like callback rather than genuine ending. Alternative representations might involve her choosing to cross dimensional threshold, walking into the upside down willingly, and sealing the gate behind her. Or perhaps something more peaceful, her powers simply fading as she closed her eyes for final time, surrounded by those who loved her. The legacy 11 would leave behind extended beyond her actions to the example she provided. A girl created as weapon, who chose to protect rather than dominate, who formed genuine connections despite being raised in isolation, who fought not from hatred but from love. These qualities defined her heroism more than her supernatural abilities. Her death would test whether those values persisted without her physical presence, whether the lessons she taught through example would continue shaping the survivors. 11's potential death or sacrifice represents the logical endpoint of a journey from lab rat to human being to hero. Her arc has always moved toward choosing her fate rather than having it imposed. The ultimate choice, to give everything for those she loves, would represent her full transformation from 11 the experiment to Jane Hopper, the home person. The emotional devastation such an ending would cause reflects the series' greatest strength, making audiences care so deeply that loss feels unbearable. Whether the Duffer brothers possess the courage to commit to this ending remains unknown, but the narrative framework stands ready to support it. The girl who opened the first gate might be the only one capable of closing the last one permanently, her power finding purpose in its own extinction. While some theories focus on permanent loss, others dare to hope for impossible resurrections. Eddie Munson's death in the Upside Down felt simultaneously heroic and premature, a character with obvious potential cut down before his story felt complete. Fan devotion to Eddie has generated one of the most elaborate theories for Season 5, the idea that he might return transformed. The theory draws from Dungeons & Dragons lore, specifically the legend of Cass the Betrayer, Vecna's right-hand lieutenant, who ultimately destroyed his master. The parallels between Eddie's death and Cass's origin story are numerous enough to suggest deliberate foreshadowing rather than coincidence. Eddie's character established itself rapidly during Season 4's opening episodes. The metalhead senior who led Hawkins High's Hellfire Club possessed a theatrical flair and genuine kindness beneath countercultural aesthetics. His enthusiasm for D&D campaigns demonstrated creative intelligence, his protection of social outcasts revealed ethical core, and his willingness to shelter the younger kids despite personal risk showed courage he claimed not to possess. Joseph Quinn's performance imbued Eddie with charisma that made him instantly beloved, a rare achievement for character introduced in a series' penultimate season. The circumstances of Eddie's death carried symbolic weight that resurrection theories seized upon. Demo bats swarmed him in the Upside Down's trailer park, their teeth tearing flesh in dozens of places. He died from these wounds, bleeding out while Dustin held him and insisted he was a hero. The method of death, specifically the bat bites, aligned precisely with Cass's origin in D&D mythology. Cass had been Vecna's lieutenant, a powerful warrior who wielded sword and shield. He'd been killed by vampire bites, then resurrected as half-vampire to serve his master, before eventually betraying and defeating him. The Hellfire Club campaign that opened Season 4 contained what might have been deliberate foreshadowing of this exact parallel. During Eddie's elaborate narration of their D&D adventure, Mike's character claimed that Vecna had been defeated previously. Eddie, speaking as Dungeon Master, corrected him with specific information. Vecna had been killed by Cass, his trusted lieutenant. The casual mention of this detail in the season's first hour took on significance when viewed through the lens of Eddie's later death and potential resurrection. The visual parallels extended beyond method of death. Eddie had grabbed a trash can lid as improvised shield during his final stand, wielding a spear fashioned from available materials. Cass, in D&D lore, was famous for his shield and sword, the artifacts through which he eventually turned against Vecna. Eddie's weapons, while crude, echoed these elements. His guitar performance of Master of Puppets before the demo bat assault added another layer. The Metallica song's lyrics about manipulation and control resonating with Cass's story of servitude and eventual rebellion, the fact that Eddie's body was never recovered provided practical foundation for resurrection theories. Dustin had to leave him in the Upside Down, unable to transport the corpse back through the gate, while Demobats still threatened. Eddie remained in that dimension, his flesh exposed to its corrupting influence, and available for whatever purposes Vecna might devise. Bodies left in the Upside Down across previous seasons had been consumed, transformed, or incorporated into larger structures. Eddie's corpse represented resource for an entity that had already demonstrated ability to reanimate and control biological matter. Vecna's established practice of taking something essential from his victims created framework for Eddie's potential resurrection. The entity consumed consciousness and essence, along with lives, incorporating his victims into himself somehow. If Vecna had absorbed part of Eddie during or after his death, that consciousness might remain preserved within the creature's psyche. Resurrecting Eddie's body while maintaining psychological control would give Vecna powerful lieutenant, someone who understood the hero's tactics and could exploit their emotional attachments. The theory proposed that Season 5 might show Eddie returning as Vecna's servant, forced to fight against Dustin and the others he'd died protecting. This dark inversion of his heroic sacrifice would create devastating emotional stakes. The characters would need to battle their friend while knowing he remained trapped inside, consciousness imprisoned while his body served their enemy. The potential for Eddie's rebellion, Cass-like betrayal of his master, would provide hope that he could be saved, or at least turned against Vecna at crucial moment. Joseph Quinn's meteoric rise to fame following Season 4 added practical considerations to resurrection theories. The actor became breakout star of the season, his charm and talent earning widespread recognition. From purely pragmatic perspective, Netflix and the Duffer Brothers might wish to capitalize on Quinn's popularity by bringing the character back. However, this commercial logic conflicted with narrative integrity. Resurrecting Eddie solely for fan service would cheapen his sacrifice and undermine the stakes established by his death. The guitar connection provided another speculative angle. Eddie's Master of Puppets performance had weaponized music against the Upside Down's creatures, sound waves somehow affecting dimensional barriers or creature behavior. If Eddie returned under Vecna's control, his musical abilities might be turned against the heroes. Alternatively, music might serve as the key to breaking through Vecna's conditioning, his friends using songs that carried personal meaning to reach Eddie's trapped consciousness. Dustin's guilt over Eddie's death created emotional foundation that resurrection would intensify rather than resolve. Dustin blamed himself for not stopping Eddie's suicidal heroics, for failing to protect someone who'd been protecting him. If Eddie returned as enemy, that guilt would compound with horror of having to fight him. If Eddie could be saved, the reunion would carry weight earned through grief and regret. Either outcome would provide Dustin with significant character material, moving him beyond comic relief into territory of genuine trauma and growth. The clearing of Eddie's name occurred posthumously in Season 4's epilogue, Hawkins' residence, learning he'd been innocent of Chrissy's murder. This rehabilitation of his reputation felt incomplete, memorial, without the person being memorialized present to appreciate it. Resurrection would allow Eddie to experience vindication, to walk through Hawkins as hero rather than fugitive. This narrative opportunity suggested potential for bringing him back, though whether as ally or antagonist remained the crucial question. The risks of resurrection extended beyond undermining Eddie's sacrifice. The series had already faced criticism for fake-out deaths, particularly Hopper's apparent demise in Season 3 that proved to be survival and capture instead. Repeating this pattern with Eddie would feel manipulative, suggesting the show wasn't willing to commit to permanent consequences for major characters. Death needed to mean something, to carry weight that couldn't be casually reversed whenever emotional or commercial convenience suggested resurrection. The Cass parallel, while compelling, might function as thematic resonance rather than literal plot blueprint. The Duffer Brothers had always used D&D elements as metaphorical framework for supernatural events, not a strict roadmap. Vecna, the D&D Lich, and Vecna, the transformed Henry Creel, shared name and broad characteristics, but differed in specifics. Similarly, Eddie's death echoing Cass's origin might be intentional parallel without requiring actual resurrection. The Metalhead's heroic stand, his refusal to run, completed his character arc, regardless of whether he returned. The alternative interpretation held that Eddie would remain dead, his sacrifice standing as permanent and meaningful. This reading emphasized that not every fan-favorite character deserved resurrection, that death's finality sometimes served story better than miraculous returns. Eddie had achieved what he sought in his final moments, proving to himself and others that he was hero rather than coward. Bringing him back might actually diminish that achievement, suggesting heroism only counted if you survived to receive acknowledgement. Fan campaigns for Eddie's return demonstrated the character's impact during his brief time in the series. Online petitions, social media advocacy, and countless theory videos reflected genuine affection for the character and desire to see more of Joseph Quinn's performance. This grassroots enthusiasm created pressure on creators, though whether that pressure would influence storytelling decisions remained uncertain. The Duffer Brothers had demonstrated willingness to follow their narrative instincts, regardless of fan expectations, for better or worse. The comparison to Billy Hargrove's arc provided both template and warning. Billy had been introduced as antagonist, gradually revealed as abuse victim, and eventually redeemed through self-sacrifice while possessed by the Mind Flayer. His death carried weight because it completed a redemption arc that wouldn't have been possible through survival. Eddie's arc differed substantially, beginning with audience sympathy and ending in heroism without requiring redemption for previous villainy. His resurrection would serve different narrative function, potentially complicating rather than completing his story. The practical question of how resurrection would work mechanically remained deliberately vague in most theories. Vecna's powers allowed manipulation of consciousness and flesh, but the specifics of reanimating dead body without simply creating puppet remained unclear. True resurrection, restoring Eddie's consciousness to his body while freeing him from Vecna's control, would require mechanisms the series hadn't established. Half measures like possession or partial resurrection created complications that might prove more trouble than narrative benefit. The Cars theory represents wish fulfillment grounded in textual evidence, a combination that makes it simultaneously compelling and suspicious. The Duffer Brothers have demonstrated willingness to resurrect presumed dead characters, Hopper being prime example, yet Eddie's sacrifice carried weight precisely because it seemed permanent, his death buying crucial seconds through genuine cost. His return would need to justify itself through story necessity rather than fan service alone, contributing meaningfully to Season 5's narrative rather than simply providing beloved character additional screen time. Whether Eddie Munson remains tragic hero or returns as tragic anti-hero, his impact on the series and its audience has proven indelible. The metalhead who ran from Chrissy's impossible death learned to stand and fight when it mattered most. That final stand, guitar wailing defiance into the Upside Down's poisoned air, created an image that transcended the character's brief appearance. Resurrection might offer Joseph Quinn additional opportunities for remarkable performance, but it risks undermining the perfect tragedy of Eddie's exit. Sometimes the story serves itself best by letting heroes rest. Eddie represents fan-favorite character whose return seems possible. Another character's return seems not just possible, but overdue. Season 2, Episode 7, The Lost Sister, remains one of Stranger Things' most controversial installments, an abrupt departure from main plot to follow 11 meeting fellow lab experiment Kali Prasad, designated 8. The episode's poor reception seemed to doom 8 to obscurity, a loose thread the series might prefer forgotten. However, strategic analysis suggests Season 5 represents the perfect opportunity to redeem both character and episode by bringing 8 back as 11's ally when fighting Vecna requires every possible advantage. Kali's introduction came during 11's search for answers about her origins and identity. Having learned of her mother Terry Ives' claims about a stolen daughter, 11 discovered references to another girl with powers, someone who'd escaped Hawkins' laboratory years before. Her psychic search located Kali in Chicago, living with a group of outcasts who'd bonded through shared trauma and marginalization. Kali welcomed 11 with genuine warmth, recognizing kinship in another survivor of Brenner's experiments. The abilities Kali possessed differed fundamentally from 11's telekinetic powers. Where 11 moved objects through mental force, Kali created illusions that could convince people they saw things that didn't exist or failed to see things that did. She could make a simple warehouse appear as luxurious apartment, transform her appearance to avoid recognition, or create terrifying visions that traumatized targets. The power operated on psychological rather than physical level, manipulating perception rather than reality itself. The episode's narrative focused on Kali's mission of revenge against former Hawkins laboratory personnel. She'd assembled her crew specifically to track down and punish those who'd participated in the experiments that had stolen their childhoods. Kaylee styled herself as punk revolutionary, using her powers to rob and intimidate while maintaining underground existence. She offered 11 belonging through shared anger, channeling rage toward those who deserved punishment rather than suppressing emotions, as 11 had learned to do. The moral test came when Coley led 11 to Ray Carroll, a former laboratory employee. Kali insisted Ray deserved death for his complicity in their suffering. 11, pointing a gun at the terrified man while his young daughters slept nearby, faced choice between vengeance and mercy. Ray's pleas revealed he'd worked as low-level technician, unaware of the experiment's true nature, until too late. His daughter's existence humanized him beyond his role at the laboratory. 11 chose not to kill him, recognizing that revenge wouldn't heal trauma and that becoming killer would betray everything she'd learned about herself. The episode's critical failure stemmed from multiple factors. Its placement disrupted narrative momentum at crucial points, pulling focus from Hawkins' crisis to Chicago side quest when audiences wanted resolution of established plotlines. The punk aesthetic and revenge narrative felt tonally inconsistent with the show's 1980s nostalgia and found family themes. Coley's crew, while potentially interesting characters, received insufficient development to justify attention they demanded. The entire episode felt like backdoor pilot for spin-off series rather than organic part of Stranger Things' story. Fan reaction was harsh enough that many assumed 8 would never appear again. The episode achieved notoriety as the series' worst, ranking consistently at bottom of fan polls and critical assessments. Linnea Berthelson's performance as Kali received mixed reviews, some praising her intensity, while others found the character one-dimensional. The general consensus held that the detour had been a mistake, an experiment that failed and should be quietly forgotten rather than revisited. However, narrative analysis revealed unrealized potential in Kali's character and abilities. Her illusion powers represented unique tactical advantage against enemies who relied on perception and psychological manipulation. Vecna's entire methodology involved creating visions, trapping victims in constructed realities drawn from their guilt and trauma. An opponent who could create counter-illusions, who understood perception as weapon and defense, might prove crucial asset in fighting him. The strategic value of combining 11 and 8's powers extended beyond simple addition. Illusions could mask 11's presence, allowing her to approach targets without detection. They could create diversions that split enemy attention. More intriguingly, Kayleigh's ability to affect what people saw and believed might allow her to shield minds from Vecna's invasive visions. If his curse required victims to perceive specific imagery to work, someone who could alter that perception might break his methodology entirely. The theory proposing 8's return in Season 5 rested on several supporting arguments. First, the Rainbow Room massacre had killed most numbered children, but not all. Brenner had mentioned escaped subjects, individuals who'd fled the laboratory before Henry Creel's rampage, or disappeared afterward. 8 represented confirmed survivor with known abilities and established connection to 11. If the crisis required assembling all available psychic resources, contacting her made logical sense. Second, 11's proven willingness to reach across distances and dimensions to find allies suggested she might seek 8 despite their complicated parting. Their shared experiences as Brenner's subjects created bond that transcended their different philosophical approaches. In desperate circumstances, 11 might set aside reservations about Carly's methods to access her unique abilities. The conversation between them, years after their last meeting, could address growth and change both had experienced. Third, redeeming episode 2 to 7 through meaningful payoff in the final season would demonstrate narrative sophistication. What seemed like failed experiment might reveal itself as long game setup. Patience rewarded for those who defended the episode or simply accepted it as part of the larger story. The Duffer Brothers had demonstrated willingness to pursue unconventional narrative choices. Bringing 8 back would signal confidence in original vision rather than capitulation to critical consensus. The practical challenges of incorporating 8 into Season 5's presumably packed narrative created legitimate concerns. The final season would need to resolve numerous existing plotlines, develop established characters, and deliver satisfying conclusions for all major arcs. Adding 8 back into the mix risked overcrowding already complex story, dividing attention among too many characters, and preventing adequate development for anyone. However, 8's role might be precisely calibrated to avoid these pitfalls. Rather than full integration into the main cast requiring extensive screen time, she could appear for a crucial sequence or two. 11 might reach out psychically, explaining the situation and requesting specific assistance. 8 could arrive for climactic battle, contribute her unique abilities at key moment, then depart having served narrative function without demanding ongoing focus. This limited appearance would satisfy those curious about her fate while respecting time constraints. The thematic resonance of 8's return centered on forgiveness and growth. 11 had left Chicago rejecting Kayleigh's path of vengeance, choosing love over hate. If 8 reappeared having evolved beyond simple revenge, having found purpose beyond punishing the past, it would demonstrate that both approaches could lead to growth. Carly channeling her anger toward protecting rather than destroying would parallel 11's journey, while validating that there wasn't single correct path to healing from trauma. The potential interaction between 8 and Vecna carried particular narrative interest. Both possessed powers operating primarily through psychological manipulation, though expressed differently. Vecna's visions invaded minds, imposing his will on victims' perceptions. Carly's illusions worked from outside, creating false perceptions without necessarily penetrating consciousness. A confrontation between them might reveal whose mastery of perception proved superior, whose understanding of how minds worked allowed victory. The question of other surviving numbered children beyond 8 remained deliberately ambiguous in the series canon. The Rainbow Room had contained multiple subjects, 2 through 17 at minimum. Henry Creel had killed most, but perhaps not all. Some might have been absent during the massacre, removed for testing or punishment. Others might have escaped during the chaos. If Season 5 intended to assemble all Brenner's surviving experiments for final confrontation, several characters beyond 8 might emerge from obscurity. This scenario of multiple powered individuals uniting against Vecna created appealing symmetry. Henry Creel had been the first, the most powerful, the prototype from whom all others derived. His transformation into Vecna represented corruption of that power toward domination and destruction. If his creations, the numbered children who'd suffered because of his existence, united to defeat him, it would represent triumph of community over isolation, of chosen purpose over imposed destiny. However, the likelihood of multiple new-powered characters appearing in the final season remained low. Introducing several previously unknown individuals with significant abilities would strain credibility and dilute focus. 8 represented the maximum reasonable expansion, a single known character whose return could be justified through established connections and whose abilities offered clear tactical value. Any additional numbered children would likely remain background elements at most, mentioned but not featured. Linnea Berthelson's availability and willingness to return presented practical consideration. The actress had moved on to other projects following her appearance in Season 2. Whether she remained interested in reprising the role, whether scheduling would allow it, and whether the production considered her return worth the coordination effort, all factored into whether the theory could manifest as reality. Actors' careers and commitments often determined character fates as much as narrative logic. The redemption arc for episode 7 through 8's meaningful return would require careful execution. Simply bringing the character back wouldn't automatically validate the controversial episode. Her appearance would need to justify itself through genuine contribution to the story rather than serving as Easter egg for dedicated fans. The illusion powers would need to prove crucial rather than redundant. Her interaction with Eleven would need to demonstrate growth and changed perspective. Anything less would feel like obligation rather than opportunity. 8's return would face challenges, including limited screen time, need for character development to show growth since Season 2, integration with existing cast without overcrowding, and demonstration that illusion powers matter strategically against Vecna. These obstacles were surmountable, but required deliberate planning and execution. Most probable scenario involved brief but significant appearance, combining powers with 11 for crucial moment before focusing again on main characters. The theory, recognizing 8's potential utility, faced ultimate test of whether narrative efficiency justified resurrection of controversial element. Season 5 would need to resolve so many plot lines that adding another, even one theoretically valuable, might prove counterproductive. The question wasn't whether 8 could contribute, but whether that contribution warranted screen time that might otherwise develop more central characters or extend crucial scenes. 8's return would transform narrative liability into asset, redeeming controversial episode through payoff years later. The concept of scattered lab survivors uniting against common creator carries thematic weight, the abused children becoming instruments of their abuser's defeat. However, Season 5's limited runtime and ensemble cast demands make significant 8 development unlikely. Most probable scenario involves brief appearance, combining powers for crucial moment before focusing again on main characters. Even minimal role would satisfy narrative curiosity while validating those who defended Episode 27's existence, demonstrating that no story element is truly wasted when viewed across the complete arc. While resurrection theories provide hope, other predictions focus on permanent losses the series has delayed too long. One of Stranger Things' most consistent criticisms involves its reluctance to kill main characters despite increasingly dire circumstances. Bob Newby, Barb Holland, Billy Hargrove, Eddie Munson, all significant but ultimately supporting characters, met tragic ends while the core group remained protected. Season 5, as the final season of an increasingly dark story, faces narrative pressure to establish genuine stakes through permanent loss. The question isn't whether main characters will die, but which ones and how many. The pattern established across 4 seasons revealed clear hierarchy of expendability. Supporting characters introduced within a season typically died within that same season, their narrative arcs compressed to allow rapid emotional investment, followed by sacrifice. Bob arrived in Season 2 and died in Season 2. Billy was introduced in Season 2 and died in Season 3. Alexi appeared and perished within Season 3. Eddie followed this pattern in Season 4. The core group from Season 1, Mike, Dustin, Lucas, Will, Eleven, Joyce, Hopper, Nancy, Jonathan, and Steve, had survived every threat across multiple years. The fake deaths complicated this pattern while undermining tension. Eleven's apparent disintegration at the end of Season 1 was revealed as survival and hiding. Hopper's supposed death in the Season 3 explosion proved to be capture and imprisonment in Russia. Max died clinically in Season 4 before Eleven revived her, though her consciousness remained absent. These reversals taught audiences to expect resurrection, to anticipate that apparent deaths would be undone through some mechanism. The emotional manipulation inherent in this approach generated criticism that the show lacked courage to commit to consequences. Cast members' comments in interviews provided circumstantial evidence that Season 5 intended to break this pattern. Gaten Matarazzo had suggested directly that characters would die, his tone carrying weight beyond typical promotional misdirection. When asked about the final season's stakes, he'd indicated that the protection main characters had enjoyed wouldn't continue, that genuine loss awaited. Millie Bobby Brown had described the ending as emotionally devastating in ways that seemed to exceed performative hyperbole. Her visible emotion, when discussing the finale, suggested personal investment in material that carried real grief. Maya Hawke's comments aligned with this pattern, indicating that Season 5 would deliver on accumulated tension rather than offering easy resolution. As someone who joined the cast in Season 3, Hawke brought outside perspective on the show's relationship with character death. Her suggestion that the finale would embrace darker implications indicated awareness that audience expectations had shifted, that viewers now demanded genuine stakes after years of near misses and reversals. The collective message from multiple cast members pointed toward tragedy rather than triumph, unmarred by loss. Steve Harrington emerged as frequent subject of death predictions based on both narrative logic and metatextual factors. His character arc had transformed him from self-absorbed teenager into protective guardian, the babysitter who discovered purpose through caring for younger kids. This redemption narrative felt complete, his growth from Season 1's antagonist to Season 4's stalwart defender having reached satisfying conclusion. Death would validate that transformation while demonstrating that heroism carried real costs. Joe Keery's rising profile outside Stranger Things, his music career and film roles suggesting potential interest in moving beyond the character, added practical consideration to speculation. The love triangle between Nancy, Jonathan, and Steve created additional pressure for resolution through elimination. Nancy's relationship with Jonathan had deteriorated during their separation. His failure to communicate creating distance neither seemed willing or able to bridge. Steve's lingering feelings for Nancy, demonstrated through protective behavior and meaningful glances, suggested unresolved emotional territory. One interpretation held that removing either Steve or Jonathan from the equation would resolve this tension while sparing Nancy the need to make explicit choice that might alienate audience factions. Eleven's potential death had been explored extensively in previous theories, but her likelihood of dying remained subject of intense debate. Arguments supporting her survival centered on the series' unlikely willingness to kill its most iconic character, the face of the franchise whose powers and personality defined much of what made Stranger Things distinctive. Counter-arguments emphasized that her death would provide ultimate stakes, the sacrifice that validated every previous near miss, and demonstrated the series' courage to embrace its darkest implications. Joyce and Hopper represented parental figures whose deaths would devastate the younger characters while serving thematic purposes. Joyce had lost Bob already, suffered through believing Hopper dead, and carried trauma from Will's repeated victimization. Her death would test whether the universe allowed any happiness for this perpetually suffering woman. Hopper had survived Russian imprisonment and reconnected with 11, his second chance at fatherhood, after losing his daughter Sarah to cancer. Killing him permanently would constitute cruel narrative choice, though perhaps appropriately bittersweet for series willing to embrace tragedy. The core four boys, Mike, Dustin, Lucas, and Will, enjoyed different levels of protection based on their centrality to the series' found family theme. Will, as the original victim whose disappearance initiated everything, seemed unlikely to die, given that his arc required completion and vindication rather than sacrifice. Mike's death would shatter 11 potentially beyond recovery, making it narratively problematic unless her own death occurred simultaneously. Lucas and Dustin faced moderate danger, their deaths potentially serving to establish stakes without destroying the group's core dynamic. Robin's survival seemed probable based on her relatively recent introduction and incomplete character development. Her coming out to Steve in Season 3 had represented significant moment for LGBTQ representation in mainstream genre television. Killing her would generate accusations of bury your gays trope, the problematic pattern of queer characters dying disproportionately in fiction. The series would likely avoid this criticism by protecting Robin, allowing her story to continue beyond simply being Steve's platonic soulmate. Max's fate remained ambiguous enough to defy simple prediction. She existed in liminal space between life and death, her body functioning but consciousness absent. Season 5 could restore her fully, leave her in permanent coma, or allow Vecna's delayed victory to claim her completely. Each outcome carried different implications for the series' willingness to embrace tragedy. Full recovery would feel like reprieve, continued coma would constitute ongoing suffering, and death would represent delayed but inevitable consequence. Younger characters like Erica Sinclair and Holly Wheeler enjoyed protection through both youth and peripheral status. Killing children, even in series dealing with supernatural horror, crossed lines that most mainstream entertainment avoided. Their survival seemed assured not through plot armor, but through industry standards and audience expectations about what material was acceptable in shows marketed to broad demographics, despite mature themes. Murray Bauman's comedic relief role made him expendable in ways that emotional anchors were not. His death would register as loss without fundamentally altering group dynamics or devastating key characters beyond temporary grief. The martial arts instructor, turned conspiracy theorist turned Russian translator, had served valuable functions but lacked deep relationships that would make his absence catastrophic. Killing Murray would establish stakes while preserving characters whose deaths would prove too costly emotionally. The prediction that at least 2 main characters would die in Season 5 derived from multiple analytical frameworks. Ensemble shows with final seasons typically embraced mortality to validate accumulated danger, demonstrate that protection couldn't last forever, and provide gravitas appropriate to conclusions. Game of Thrones, though controversial in its final season, had killed numerous major characters across its run. Lost had sacrificed beloved characters to underscore its themes about sacrifice and purpose. Stranger Things, having deferred major deaths across 4 seasons, owed similar accounting. The bittersweet ending the Duffer Brothers promised required balancing victory against cost. Pure triumph where everyone survived would feel unearned given the escalating threats and established dangers. Pyrrhic victory where most died would constitute nihilistic conclusion, at odds with the series' fundamental optimism about friendship and love's power. The sweet spot involved significant losses, probably 2 to 4 main characters, creating grief that shadowed victory without consuming it entirely. Vecna's death remained the sole certainty in this speculation. The villain couldn't survive Season 5 without negating the entire final confrontation's purpose. Whether his death came through Eleven's sacrifice, Will's intervention, collective assault, or some combination, Henry Creel's story would end permanently. The question wasn't whether he died, but what his death cost the heroes, how much they'd need to sacrifice to achieve victory over an entity that had survived every previous attempt to destroy him. The emotional impact versus shock value distinction mattered significantly for evaluating death predictions. Killing characters simply to surprise audiences or demonstrate that anyone could die represented manipulation rather than storytelling. Deaths needed to serve narrative and thematic purposes, completing arcs or enabling other characters' development. Steve dying to protect Dustin would mean something beyond body count. A random death in battle without clear purpose would feel like waste. Predictions attempting to be too specific risked foolishness when the actual season revealed different choices. The Duffer Brothers had demonstrated unpredictability in their plotting, zigging where audiences expected zags. Detailed predictions about who would die in what order, under which circumstances represented speculation rather than analysis. The broader framework that Season 5 would kill main characters to establish stakes and provide appropriate gravity to conclusion seemed sound. The specifics would remain unknown until episodes aired. The social media speculation surrounding character deaths revealed audience investment in these fictional people. Passionate advocacy for favourite characters' survival, detailed arguments about who deserved to live based on suffering already endured or arcs requiring completion, and emotional rejection of scenarios involving specific deaths all demonstrated successful character development. The Duffer Brothers had created people audiences cared about deeply enough that their potential deaths generated genuine distress. The comparison to other ensemble shows' finales provided limited guidance, given how differently series approached conclusions. Some protected all main characters, others embraced carnage. The decision reflected each show's relationship with its audience and its thematic concerns. Stranger Things had built identity around hope, friendship, and love's power to overcome darkness. Wholesale slaughter would betray these themes. Selective sacrifice that honoured them while acknowledging real costs seemed more probable. The possibility that only supporting characters would die, that the core group would survive intact through combination of skill and luck, couldn't be dismissed entirely. This outcome would disappoint those demanding stakes, but might satisfy the larger audience that watched primarily for character relationships rather than narrative boldness. Commercial considerations, potential spin-offs, and desire to leave fans happy rather than devastated all might influence decisions toward preservation rather than sacrifice. The question of whether allowing main characters to survive constituted creative cowardice or appropriate restraint divided critical opinion. Some argued that protection of beloved characters, despite dire circumstances, undermined narrative integrity, reducing threats to temporary inconveniences rather than genuine dangers. Others countered that killing characters to prove willingness to kill characters served ego rather than story, that preserving relationships audiences valued represented valid creative choice rather than weakness. Death predictions remain speculative, but narrative logic suggests Season 5 cannot end with everyone surviving intact. The series owes its audience genuine stakes after years of protection, demonstration that supernatural threats carry consequences beyond trauma and temporary separation. Who falls and who survives will define the series' willingness to commit to its darkest impulses while honouring the relationships and themes that made audiences care. The likely outcome involves at least 2 main character deaths, probably including either Steve or Eleven, with several others facing permanent change, even if they survive physically. The final episode should feel like victory earned through sacrifice rather than gift. Granted by plot armor, success shadowed by losses that cannot be undone or forgotten. Individual fates matter less than collective struggle, the final battle that will determine not just who survives, but whether Hawkins itself can be saved. Season 4 ended with Hawkins wounded, 4 gates splitting the town like scars across reality. Season 5 must escalate beyond previous threats, transforming Hawkins from a small town with supernatural problem into ground zero for dimensional war. The final battle theory predicts that the Upside Down and normal world will merge completely, creating hybrid landscape where every resident faces monsters and heroes unite with military forces for last stand against Vecna's army. The scale suggested by episode titles and production hints indicates the series will conclude with its most ambitious sequence yet. The 8 episode titles released for Season 5 provided framework for understanding how the final season would structure its narrative progression. Each title carried implications about content and themes, though the Duffer Brothers had demonstrated willingness to mislead through deliberately vague or misdirecting episode names. Analysing these titles offered educated speculation about narrative arc, while acknowledging that actual episodes might subvert expectations established through naming conventions. The Crawl, as the premier title, suggested movement that was slow, deliberate, perhaps backward. The word evoked multiple associations, from military crawling through hostile territory to the opening text scroll of space opera films. Some theorists proposed the episode would literally replay Season 1's opening, showing Will's disappearance from new perspective that revealed Vecna's involvement from the beginning. Others suggested it referred to the slow approach of dimensional collapse, time moving at altered pace as reality destabilized. The ambiguity served its purpose, generating speculation while revealing little definitive. The vanishing of, as the second episode's title immediately recalled, the vanishing of Will Byers from the series premiere. The ellipsis suggested another disappearance, another character pulled into supernatural circumstances. Fan theories focused heavily on Holly Wheeler, the youngest Wheeler child who'd remained background presence across 4 seasons. Her potential kidnapping would bring the Wheeler family fully into the supernatural conflict, forcing Karen and Ted to confront realities they'd avoided acknowledging. Alternative interpretations proposed the vanishing might be metaphorical, referring to hope, innocence, or some abstract concept rather than literal person. The Turnbow trap and sorcerer offered less obvious interpretive footholds. Turnbow wasn't established character or location within the series, suggesting either new element or reference so obscure that casual viewers wouldn't recognize it. The military connotation of trap implied strategic deception, perhaps heroes luring Vecna into vulnerable position. Sorcerer aligned with Dungeons and Dragons terminology, while potentially referencing Vecna directly. The wizard, who'd achieved lichdom through dark magic. The episode might explore his transformation from Henry Creel into the entity he'd become, or it might simply use the title metaphorically for magic-heavy content. Shock Jock carried clearer implications related to radio communication and emergency broadcasts. The term referred to controversial radio personalities, but also to the broader concept of using airwaves for communication. In crisis scenario where Hawkins faced dimensional invasion, radio might serve as coordination tool for resistance efforts. Distress calls from survivors, military communications, or attempts to warn surrounding areas all fit within framework suggested by this title. The episode might show Hawkins' isolation breaking down as outside world finally acknowledged supernatural crisis they could no longer ignore or cover up. Escape from Camazotz provided the clearest literary reference among the episode titles. Camazotz appeared in Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time as planet consumed by evil entity called the Black Thing, where conformity was enforced and individuality suppressed. The darkness covering Camazotz in that novel paralleled the Mind Flayer's shadow, spreading over Hawkins. The title suggested heroes would need to literally escape from location, consumed by upside-down influence, breaking free from dimensional trap to continue their resistance. The bridge evoked multiple interpretations depending on context. Bridges connected separated locations, suggesting potential linkage between Hawkins and outside world, or between normal reality and the upside down. The episode might feature literal bridge as strategic location, or use the term metaphorically for connection between past and future, living and dead, or any number of abstract concepts. Given the series' established interest in dimensional barriers, the bridge might represent threshold between realities, the liminal space where final confrontation would occur. The Right Side Up, as finale title, generated the most intense speculation and had been explored in previous theory sections. The phrase mirrored upside down, while suggesting correction, transformation, or inversion. Whether it referred to reality restored, dimension transformed, or something entirely unexpected, the title promised resolution to the dimensional conflict that had defined the series. The optimistic reading held that it signified victory and healing. The darker interpretation suggested bittersweet transformation, where nothing could return to how it was before. Production reports from Season 5's filming provided additional evidence about the final battle's scope. Multiple sources indicated the show had constructed its largest sets ever, massive spaces designed to accommodate action sequences involving dozens of performers. The Hawkins Town Square apparently received full-scale recreation in studio, allowing controlled environment for complex stunt work and special effects integration. Practical effects work, always a series strength, had expanded to include large-scale creature puppetry and environmental destruction, requiring careful coordination. The number of extras hired for Season 5 exceeded previous seasons substantially, suggesting crowd scenes or battle sequences involving many participants. While Stranger Things had always maintained relatively intimate scale, focused on core characters, the finale apparently required population-level involvement. This aligned with theories about Hawkins residents finally confronting supernatural threat directly, rather than remaining ignorant or being evacuated. The townspeople who'd lived through years of cover stories and explanations might find themselves fighting alongside the teenagers who protected them unknowingly. The confirmed time jump to fall 1987 created interesting narrative possibilities. 18 months would have passed since Season 4's conclusion in spring 1986, allowing characters to age, recover from trauma, and prepare for confrontation they knew was coming. The temporal gap also permitted Hawkins to change significantly, the town potentially becoming militarized zone, evacuated wasteland, or something between these extremes. The 4 massive gates remained open at Season 4's end. Their influence spreading over 18 months could transform the entire region. The theory of dimensions fully merging proposed that by Season 5's climax, the barrier between Hawkins and the Upside Down would collapse entirely. The two realities would overlap, creating hybrid space where locations existed simultaneously in both states. Characters might see both normal buildings and their shadow equivalents, fight creatures in spaces that were neither fully one dimension nor the other. This merging would represent Vecna's ultimate goal, breaking down separation between realities to remake the world according to his philosophy. Military and governmental involvement seemed inevitable given the scale of dimensional rifts and impossibility of continued cover-ups. 4 massive gates converging on Hawkins Center couldn't be explained away through gas leaks or natural disasters. By 1987, federal authorities would have acknowledged the supernatural threat, though their response might range from quarantine to military assault. The integration of soldiers, tanks, and conventional weaponry into battle against dimensional monsters would create visual spectacle while raising questions about effectiveness of mundane force against supernatural threats. The convergence of all scattered storylines represented necessary narrative development. Characters separated since Season 4, the Byers family in California, Hopper escaping from Russia, Nancy and the Hawkins crew, dealing with immediate crisis, would need to reunite for final battle. This geographical consolidation created logistical challenges for the narrative, but promised emotional payoffs as relationships strained by distance reconnected under pressure. The reunion scenes would need to balance joy of reconnection against urgency of immediate danger. The strategic elements required for successful assault on Vecna drew from established mythology while introducing new complications. Music had proven effective against his curse, suggesting sonic weapons might disrupt his powers. Fire had hurt him during Season 4's attack, implying vulnerability to thermal assault. 11's psychic powers remained primary threat to his existence, but previous confrontations had demonstrated she couldn't defeat him alone. Combining these elements, musical distraction plus fire assault plus psychic attack, while coordinating across multiple locations, would test the hero's ability to work together under impossible pressure. The upside-down creatures, Demogorgons, Demobats, and potentially the Mind Flayer itself, would serve as Vecna's army, defending him from assault. These entities had proven deadly in small numbers. Deployed at scale during dimensional merging, they would represent threat to everyone in Hawkins. The battles wouldn't be limited to heroes with special training or powers, but would engulf entire population, forcing ordinary people to fight for survival against monsters that shouldn't exist. The Creel House, as epicenter of supernatural activity, provided logical focal point for climactic confrontation. Vecna's physical body resided there in the upside-down version, his connection to the location stemming from his childhood in that house. The building carried symbolic weight as site where Henry Creel murdered his family, where his transformation from troubled child to monster accelerated. Destroying Vecna there would represent confronting evil at its origin, eliminating the source rather than merely battling symptoms. Multiple simultaneous battles across different locations would allow the ensemble cast to contribute meaningfully without overcrowding single scene. One group might assault Vecna directly, while another closed dimensional rifts. A third evacuated civilians, and a fourth fought delaying action against creature swarms. This distributed approach to climax served both practical and narrative purposes, giving each character heroic moment, while acknowledging that victory required collective effort rather than single champion's triumph. The incorporation of Dungeons & Dragons' campaign structure into Final Battle's choreography aligned with the series' consistent use of the game as metaphorical framework. The party had always approached their adventures using D&D logic, assigning roles based on game archetypes and strategizing using campaign thinking. The final confrontation might explicitly parallel their campaigns, with Mike serving as real-world dungeon master, coordinating different groups' efforts, while the battle unfolded according to plans that resembled game strategy more than military tactics. The episode title, The Bridge, suggested specific location where crucial action would occur, the threshold, between dimensions where heroes might make final stand. Bridges were inherently liminal spaces, neither here nor there, existing between separated locations. A dimensional bridge, the space where realities overlapped most completely, would provide appropriate setting for battle that would determine whether those realities remained separate or merged permanently. Escape from Camazotz implied that heroes might become trapped in the merged dimension, requiring desperate flight from location consumed by darkness. This scenario aligned with theories about sacrifice, suggesting some characters might remain behind to ensure others escape. The literary reference to Langel's work reinforced themes about love's power to overcome darkness, familial bonds providing strength against conformity and evil, and the necessity of individual choice in resisting totalitarian control. The civilian population's role in final battle remained uncertain but potentially significant. Hawkins' residents had been kept ignorant or deceived across 4 seasons, their safety maintained through their ignorance. If dimensional barriers collapsed and creatures emerged into normal reality at scale, that protection would shatter. The townspeople would face choice between fleeing or fighting, accepting that their home had become battlefield in war they barely understood. Those who chose to fight would represent ordinary courage, people without powers or special training standing against impossible odds. The government's response to open dimensional invasion would test whether official institutions could adapt to supernatural reality. The military's conventional weapons might prove effective against physical creatures, even if they couldn't directly harm Vecna. Soldiers could evacuate civilians, establish defensive perimeters, and buy time for heroes with specialized abilities to reach critical objectives. The cooperation between governmental forces and teenage heroes would require overcoming mutual distrust built across previous seasons' cover-ups and conflicts. The sacrifice required to close gates permanently provided thematic through-line connecting various battle elements. Previous closures had been temporary because they hadn't addressed underlying causes, merely forcing dimensional barriers back together without healing the fundamental tear. Permanent closure might require anchor on one side or the other, consciousness powerful enough to maintain separation through continuous effort. This necessity would create moments of terrible choice, characters deciding who would remain behind to ensure others' safety. The balance between spectacle and emotional resonance represented crucial challenge for final battle's execution. Large-scale action, while visually impressive and commercially appealing, could overwhelm the character relationships that gave the series its emotional core. The most successful resolution would weave together intimate character moments with epic scope, personal sacrifices occurring within context of civilization-level threat. The battle needed to feel simultaneously enormous in scale and deeply personal in stakes. Victory's cost would define whether the ending achieved the bittersweet quality the Duffer Brothers promised. Pure triumph without loss would feel unearned after 4 seasons of escalating danger. Pyrrhic victory, where everyone died, would constitute nihilistic conclusion, inappropriate for series built on hope and friendship. The sweet spot involved significant sacrifices, probably including major character deaths that shadowed victory without consuming it. Success achieved through loss created resonance that pure triumph or complete tragedy couldn't match. The aftermath of final battle, presumably addressed in Episode 8's latter portions, would determine whether the series stuck its landing or stumbled at the finish line. Questions requiring resolution included the fate of the Upside Down after Vecna's defeat, whether dimensional barriers could be restored, what happened to survivors psychologically and physically, how Hawkins rebuilt from devastation, and whether the characters could find peace after years of trauma. The challenge involved providing closure while acknowledging that some wounds never fully heal. The visual representation of reality and dimension merging would test the show's special effects capabilities while defining how audiences experience the climax. Previous depictions of the Upside Down had relied on darkness, decay, and floating particles to distinguish it from normal reality. A merged space would need to convey both dimensions simultaneously, perhaps showing buildings in states of superposition, flickering between intact and ruined, or displaying both versions overlaid in impossible architectural configurations. The scope would exceed previous seasons by orders of magnitude, battles involving hundreds rather than handful, destruction measured in city blocks rather than individual buildings, and stakes encompassing dimensional integrity rather than individual survival. Yet this expansion needed to preserve the intimate character work that distinguished Stranger Things from generic disaster films. The balance between scale and intimacy, between epic and personal, would determine whether the finale satisfied audiences invested in both spectacular action and emotional authenticity. Season 5's final battle represents culmination of 9 years' storytelling, bringing every element together for one last confrontation. The scope will test production capabilities while demanding emotional resonance amid spectacle. Previous finales balanced action and character work successfully. Season 5 must amplify both simultaneously, delivering largest action sequences while providing appropriate emotional conclusions for beloved characters. Whether Hawkins survives as recognizable place or transforms into something new, whether dimensional barriers restore or permanently dissolve, the battle will define the series' legacy. Scale matters less than stakes, and stakes have never been higher. The ancient evil that began by targeting one 12-year-old boy will face entire community united in defense of their home, their reality, and each other. Yet amid theories about battles and sacrifices, one controversial idea suggests none of it matters at all. The most controversial theory regarding Season 5's ending proposes that the entire series exists within a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. The final scene, according to this theory, would pull back to reveal Mike's basement, with the boys rolling dice and concluding their longest campaign ever. This would create perfect symmetry, the series beginning and ending with D&D, while explaining supernatural elements as teenage imagination. It would also represent one of the worst narrative betrayals possible, invalidating 4 seasons of emotional investment with "it was all a game" revelation. The evidence supporting this theory derived primarily from the series' consistent integration of Dungeons & Dragons as metaphorical framework. The very first scene showed the boys mid-campaign, rolling dice and battling monsters, with names they would later apply to real threats. The Demogorgon from their game became the name for the creature from the Upside Down. The Mind Flayer, encountered in Season 2's campaign, preceded their discovery of the Shadow Monster. Vecna himself, the Lich from D&D lore, became the identity they assigned to Henry Creel's transformed state. The character parallels between the boys and their D&D personas offered additional support for the theory. Mike played Paladin, the righteous defender, mirroring his role as group leader and Eleven's protector. Lucas served as Ranger, the careful strategist and lookout, aligned with his practical approach to problems. Dustin embodied the Bard, using intelligence and charm rather than direct force. Will played Cleric or Wizard depending on campaign, roles associated with magic and healing that might prefigure his theorized psychic abilities. Every major threat the characters faced had D&D equivalent or inspiration. The naming wasn't coincidental, but rather deliberate connection between game and reality. This consistent pattern suggested either that the boys applied familiar framework to incomprehensible supernatural events, or that the supernatural events existed only within campaign narrative, they'd constructed. The theory proposed the latter, that Will's disappearance, Eleven's powers, and every subsequent adventure had been elaborate, collaborative storytelling rather than actual experience. The thematic resonance of such an ending appealed to certain analytical frameworks. The series would come full circle, returning to the basement where it began with revelation that transformed everything audiences believed they'd watched. The deaths, the trauma, the sacrifices all would be revealed as fictional within fiction, dice rolls, and imagination rather than genuine loss. Characters presumed dead would be alive and well, sitting around the table, having spent evening playing game together. The emotional devastation this would cause some viewers might be offset by relief that beloved characters hadn't actually suffered. The appeal of the D&D campaign theory rested partly on its potential to resurrect lost characters and erase trauma. Barb would be alive, having simply left the campaign early to go home. Bob would exist as Joyce's actual boyfriend rather than character, who died. Eddie would be present, perhaps having joined the campaign for this final epic session. Billy's redemption would be game narrative rather than actual death. Every loss would be undone, every sacrifice revealed as temporary within the game's context. However, the problems with this ending far outweighed its superficial attractions. The "it was all a dream" narrative device had earned derision across decades of television and film for good reason. It represented ultimate narrative cop-out, writers unable or unwilling to commit to consequences of events they'd established. Every emotional moment, every character development, every relationship formed across the series would be retroactively invalidated as performance within game rather than genuine experience. The comparison to infamous examples of this device illustrated why audiences had learned to reject it. The St. Elsewhere finale had revealed that show's entire run existed within autistic child snow globe imagination, a twist that infuriated viewers who'd invested in characters and relationships for 6 seasons. The Dallas episode revealing an entire season as Dream had become punchline rather than respected narrative choice. The Newhart finale's similar revelation worked primarily as comedy rather than drama, acceptable because the show had always been lightweight sitcom rather than series demanding emotional investment. Modern audiences possessed even less patience for such revelations than viewers of previous generations. Decades of exposure to twist endings and meta-narrative tricks had created sophistication about storytelling devices. Contemporary viewers recognized it was all X endings as lazy writing, refusal to engage with material seriously. For Stranger Things to employ this device would constitute a betrayal of audience trust, suggesting the Duffer Brothers had been engaged in elaborate practical joke rather than sincere storytelling. The practical objections extended beyond audience reception into internal narrative consistency. If the entire series existed as D&D campaign, numerous elements wouldn't make sense within that framework. The boys couldn't have imagined elaborate Russian conspiracies, detailed government operations, or complex character psychology beyond their adolescent understanding. The scientific explanations, dimensional physics, and psychological depth demonstrated in the show exceeded what middle school D&D players would incorporate into their campaigns. The Duffer Brothers had explicitly denied this theory in multiple interviews, stating clearly that the series would not end with revelation that events were game or dream. Their denials carried weight because creators generally avoided lying directly about major plot points, preferring misdirection through vague statements rather than explicit false claims. When asked specifically about the D&D campaign ending, they'd indicated it wouldn't occur, that the supernatural events in the series were actual within the show's reality. The persistence of the theory, despite official debunking, suggested psychological function beyond rational analysis. Fans anticipating tragic ending might prefer believing in potential escape hatch, narrative device that would undo losses and restore characters to safety. The D&D campaign theory provided that comfort, suggesting that no matter how dark Season 5 became, it might all be revealed as an elaborate game with no permanent consequences. This hope, while understandable, represented denial rather than engagement with the story being told. The distinction between D&D as thematic framework versus literal narrative container mattered significantly. The series had always used the game as metaphor, way for characters to process and understand supernatural experiences through familiar framework. They named monsters after game creatures because those were references they shared, common language for discussing incomprehensible reality. This thematic use enriched the story without suggesting the story existed only within game's boundaries. Will's painting from Season 4 demonstrated how D&D imagery served symbolic rather than literal function. His artwork showed the party as heroes battling Red Dragon, representation of their friendship and shared struggles rendered through game aesthetics. This didn't mean their actual experiences were game, but rather that game provided vocabulary for expressing relationships and challenges that transcended specific supernatural threats. The painting functioned as art inspired by life rather than evidence that life was actually art. The theory misunderstood the show's relationship to its influences and frameworks. Stranger Things drew inspiration from 1980s popular culture, Stephen King novels, Steven Spielberg films, and yes, Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. These influences shaped the series' aesthetics, themes, and storytelling approaches without containing the narrative within their boundaries. The show honored its inspirations while maintaining its own reality, actual supernatural events occurring in fictional world rather than existing solely as references to source material. The emotional stakes that made Stranger Things compelling required genuine consequences within the show's established reality. Audiences invested in characters' survival, relationships, and development because those elements mattered within the story's world. If everything was revealed as game, that investment would be exposed as foolish. Viewers having cared about dice rolls and teenage imagination rather than actual people facing actual dangers. The betrayal would be complete, rendering previous emotional experiences hollow rather than meaningful. The finale, titled The Right Side Up, had generated speculation about D&D campaign revelation because it suggested inversion or revelation of true nature. However, more plausible interpretations existed that didn't require invalidating entire series. The title might refer to reality being restored after dimensional incursion, the normal world reasserting itself as right in contrast to Upside Down's corruption. It might indicate the heroes succeeding in their mission, setting things right through their efforts. These interpretations honored the story's established framework rather than demolishing it. The D&D campaign theory represents fan speculation at its most misguided, mistaking thematic resonance for literal revelation. While D&D provides framework and metaphor throughout the series, reducing the entire narrative to game diminishes both stories' power. The game enriches the show by providing shared language and symbolic structure. The show honors the game by demonstrating how collaborative storytelling and imagination create meaning and connection. Neither needs to contain the other literally to achieve these effects. The Duffer Brothers understand this distinction, hence their clear denial of the campaign ending theory. They've crafted story that takes supernatural threats seriously within its fictional world, that treats character deaths and sacrifices as genuinely consequential. Fans clinging to the D&D theory, despite debunking, likely seek safety net against potential tragic ending, preferring narrative invalidation over character death. The series deserves better than such reductive conclusion. An indication suggests it will receive proper ending that honors both its fantastical elements and emotional reality. The basement where the story began will likely appear in the finale, but as location of reunion or reflection rather than revelation that nothing mattered beyond dice and imagination. More compelling than meta-theories are the mysteries embedded within the show's mythology itself. Beneath the supernatural battles and dimensional threats, Stranger Things has cultivated mysteries about character origins and connections. Some questions seem deliberately planted, awaiting payoff. Others emerge from careful viewers' observation of unexplained details. Season 5, as the final season, faces expectation to resolve these narrative threads, though selective resolution may prove more satisfying than comprehensive explanation. The identity of Eleven's biological father remains one of the series' most persistent, unanswered questions. Terry Ives, Eleven's mother, participated in MKUltra experiments while pregnant, exposing the developing fetus to psychotropic drugs and psychological conditioning. Dr. Brenner delivered the baby and immediately separated mother and child, claiming the infant had died. Terry's subsequent attempts to reclaim her daughter led to electroshock treatments that destroyed her mind, leaving her catatonic but aware, trapped in memories of her stolen child. The father's identity was never addressed in these revelations. One theory proposed that Vecna, as Henry Creel, might be Eleven's biological father. The timeline presented complications for this speculation, as Henry had been imprisoned in the laboratory with power-suppressing chip for years before Terry's participation in experiments. His genetic material might have been harvested for breeding programs, creating children from his DNA without his conscious participation. However, the series had provided no evidence of such programs, and the revelation would add little to existing narratives about Eleven's origin and purpose. Alternative theories suggested another powerful psychic individual, perhaps another early MKUltra subject, had fathered Eleven. This would explain her extraordinary abilities as inherited trait rather than purely induced through experimental procedures. Brenner's selection of Terry as experimental subject might have been strategic, pairing her with someone whose genetics would produce optimal results. The practical question remained whether this revelation would serve the story or simply answer question for completeness' sake. Eleven herself had shown minimal interest in identifying her biological father. Her quest for family had focused on her mother, whose loss she could actively mourn, and on chosen family like Hopper, whose relationship provided what biological connection couldn't. Mike, Joyce, the friends who'd accepted her, these relationships mattered more than abstract genetic connection to unknown man. Season 5 might acknowledge this by leaving the question unresolved, validating that family was defined through love and choice rather than biology. Joyce Byers' apparent connection to supernatural events beyond coincidental proximity had generated theories about her own experimental past. Her immediate belief in unconventional solutions during Season 1, her construction of Christmas light communication system without scientific training, and her persistent intuition about Will's survival despite impossible circumstances, all suggested familiarity with concepts she shouldn't understand. The theory that Joyce had participated in MKUltra experiments alongside Terry Ives, escaping before full conditioning, would explain these anomalies while connecting major characters through shared traumatic history. The implications extended to Will if Joyce possessed latent psychic abilities from experimental exposure. Genetic inheritance might explain his unique connection to the Upside Down, his survival where others perished, and his persistent sensitivity to dimensional proximity. Lonnie's treatment of Will as different from Jonathan could reflect awareness that Will wasn't biologically his son, that Joyce had been pregnant from previous relationship or experimental procedure when they'd met. This revelation would recontextualize family dynamics while providing scientific framework for Will's apparent abilities. However, the evidence supporting Joyce's experimental past remained largely circumstantial. Determined mothers throughout history had accomplished remarkable feats to save their children, without requiring supernatural explanation. Joyce's intuition might simply reflect deep maternal connection rather than psychic residue from government experiments. Occam's razor suggested simpler interpretation, that she was remarkably perceptive and determined woman rather than former test subject. The series might honour her character more by leaving her achievements as products of love and will rather than experimental enhancement. Karen Wheeler's potential identity as Alice Creel, Henry's younger sister who survived the 1959 massacre, represented one of the more elaborate fan theories. Alice had been present during the Creel family murders, experiencing the same torments as her mother and brother. Victor Creel's testimony indicated Alice had died from her injuries, but alternative interpretation held that she'd survived, been relocated under new identity, and grown up to become Karen Wheeler, née Alice Creel. The timeline aligned roughly, placing Karen at appropriate age to have been young girl in 1959. The physical resemblance between Karen and Nancy lent superficial support to genetic connection between Wheeler family and Creel bloodline. Nancy's investigative abilities and moral courage might represent inherited traits from grandmother, who'd survived supernatural horror. However, this theory required numerous assumptions about government programs creating new identities for traumatized children, about Alice never revealing her past to her family, and about coincidences that strained credibility beyond breaking point. The lack of any textual evidence supporting this theory beyond timeline compatibility and vague physical similarities suggested it represented wishful connection-making rather than legitimate foreshadowing. Karen had been developed primarily as representation of suburban mother archetype, her character serving functions unrelated to supernatural mythology. Revealing her as Alice Creel would require extensive exposition, explaining decades of hidden history, exposition that would consume time better spent on established narrative threads. The origin of the Upside Down itself remained ambiguous in ways that might never receive complete explanation. Had the dimension always existed as parallel reality to the normal world, or had Eleven's banishment of Henry Creel created it by tearing reality and establishing Shadow Realm? The frozen state of that dimension on November 6, 1983 suggested the latter, that Eleven's opening of the first gate had somehow locked the Upside Down at that temporal moment. Yet the dimension's existence seemed too complex, too fully realized to be purely created artifact. The alternative interpretation held that the Upside Down had always existed but remained separate until 11 breached dimensional barriers. Henry Creel's arrival there had transformed pre-existing Shadow Realm according to his consciousness and philosophy, reshaping neutral dimension into manifestation of his nihilistic worldview. The Mind Flayer might be his creation or transformation of entity that already existed there. Distinguishing between these possibilities might prove impossible and perhaps unnecessary for narrative resolution. Will's lingering questions extended beyond theories about his potential powers into simpler mysteries about why the Demogorgon specifically targeted him. Vecna's involvement seemed probable, given what was later revealed about his influence over upside-down creatures. Had he directed the Demogorgon to take Will alive because he sensed something valuable about the boy? Had it been random selection that only seemed meaningful in retrospect? The distinction mattered for understanding whether Will's role in the story stemmed from genuine, supernatural significance or from meaning generated through surviving random trauma. The questions unlikely to receive resolution in Season 5 included numerous minor mysteries and background details. Every character's complete life history wouldn't be explored. The full extent of government supernatural research programs would remain partially obscure. The Upside Down's complete ecology and dimensional physics wouldn't be systematically explained. These gaps weren't narrative failures, but rather acknowledgement that some elements served atmospheric purposes rather than requiring mechanical explanation. The decision about which mysteries to resolve and which to leave ambiguous reflected narrative wisdom about what truly mattered. Eleven's biological father might be interesting trivia, but didn't affect her character, development, or relationships. Joyce's potential experimental past might provide neat explanation, but wouldn't change who she'd become or what she'd accomplished. Karen Wheeler's secret identity would add complexity without enhancing existing themes. Some questions served story better remaining unanswered, their mystery preserving sense of depth and unknown rather than closing every possible interpretive avenue. The distinction between mysteries requiring resolution for narrative satisfaction versus those serving primarily as fan speculation material guided expectations for Season 5. The fate of Max's consciousness needed resolution because it directly affected major characters and ongoing plot. The identity of Eleven's father didn't require resolution because it served no essential narrative function. Will's significance and potential abilities demanded clarification because they'd been foreshadowed across multiple seasons. The origin of the Upside Down could remain ambiguous because understanding its creation mattered less than knowing it could be sealed permanently. The temptation toward comprehensive explanation, closing every plot thread and answering every question, often produced worse storytelling than selective resolution. Over-explanation removed mystery that allowed audiences to engage imaginatively with material. The best endings provided closure on emotional and thematic levels while leaving certain mechanical details to interpretation. How exactly something worked mattered less than whether characters achieved growth and relationships found resolution. Season 5 would succeed not by answering every question, but by addressing questions that mattered to character arcs and thematic development. 11 needed to understand her own power and purpose, but not necessarily her genetic heritage. Will needed to discover his significance and agency, but not necessarily the complete mechanics of his upside-down connection. The heroes needed to defeat Vecna and seal dimensional rifts, but not necessarily understand every detail of how those dimensions originated or functioned. The mysteries that would remain unresolved after the finale would become part of the series' legacy, fuel for continued discussion and interpretation. Fan communities would debate unanswered questions for years, developing theories and analyses that extended the story's life beyond its official conclusion. This ongoing engagement represented feature rather than failure, evidence that the series had created a world rich enough to sustain multiple interpretations and deep enough that not everything could be excavated in 42 episodes. Mystery resolution serves story only when revelation enhances rather than explains. Season 5 faces temptation to answer every question, tie every thread, but restraint might prove wiser. 11's father matters less than her chosen family. Joyce's past matters less than her present determination. The Upside Down's origin matters less than whether heroes can close it permanently. The best endings leave room for imagination while providing emotional closure. These mysteries represent narrative texture rather than essential plot, and their potential resolution should serve character development more than fan curiosity about mechanical details. Some questions exist to be wondered about rather than definitively answered, their mystery contributing to the series' depth more than any explanation could. As theories multiply and speculation intensifies, the only certainty is uncertainty itself until the final credits roll. And so, our journey through Hawkins' history and imagination concludes where all good stories do, at the edge of the unknown. Theories multiply and fans debate, but truth awaits in episodes still unaired. Whether heroes triumph or fall, whether Hawkins survives or transforms, whether theories prove prescient or laughably wrong, the series has given us characters to love and mysteries to ponder. As you drift into dreams, perhaps you'll visit that small Indiana town, walk its tree-lined streets, hear the hum of Christmas lights speaking messages, and understand that some magic requires no explanation beyond the joy of believing. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your sleep be filled with bicycles, walkie-talkies, and the enduring power of friendship against impossible darkness.